Phoenix Nights. Chapter 1369. Young Master are new. Knowing that Yang Chendong was displeased, Tiger's Mane still wanted to continue to fight for it. However, Yang Chendong spoke again. This time, the young master will personally lead the troops, so you don't have to ask for instructions. By the way, this trip will use a lot of manpower. The required food and other things will be transported over from Red Nest City soon. Yes, everything will be handed over to the logistics command. As soon as he spoke, he only mentioned Yang Xi's name and even excluded Yu Mian. Immediately, Yu Mian's expression became very ugly. Yu Mian was not as simple as Yu Qian's son. If that was the case, Yang Chendong would not have given him such an important task. At most, he would have spent more money to find a comfortable position for him to stay. But he didn't. Instead, he placed such an important burden on him. Just this point alone was enough to prove his ability. However, having ability did not mean that he was completely open-minded. At least, when it came to dealing with the matters in the Far Eastern region, he did not do very well. His thinking was too conservative. In this matter, Yang Chendong could also see that a person like Yu Mian had no problem keeping his position, but when it came to pioneering, he was still lacking a lot. Since that was the case, he would just guard his home well. This could be considered as making the best use of people. Tiger's Mane and Yu Mian, the two people who opposed increasing the investment in the Far Eastern region, had stepped aside. Only Yang Xi, who had always advocated for greater support, was placed in an important position. This already showed Yang Chendong's attitude. By the way, this time, the new Second Army will also be transferred to the front line of the Far Eastern region. The two cities that they are guarding, Shajing and Jingzhou, will belong to the new First Army's line of defense in the future. The two of you must guard them well. Yang Chendong seemed to have thought of something and added this sentence. After that, he turned around and left. They had not rested along the way, so they had to have a good sleep first. After Yang Chendong left, Yang Xi also had a lot of things to do and went to the logistics command to make arrangements. Only Tiger's Mane and Yu Mian were left behind. Needless to say, Tiger's Mane's performance this time had disappointed the young master. He regretted it 1,000 times. If he knew that the young master valued the Far Eastern region so much, he would not care whether the effort and the reward was proportional. He would have ordered the troops to send support long ago. Now, not only himself, even the new Second Army's army, this time, even the new Second Army was thrown to the side. This made him feel very uncomfortable. However, Yu Mian, he did not have to admit. After all, we mains, he's mains not, he's, unconvinced to the young masters, he, to the tiger and to the mane, he and Ming. The Far Eastern region is too far away from us, and it's too barren. The more support we send there, the greater the losses will be. I'll talk to the sixth young master about this matter now. I want to dissuade him. As he spoke, Yu Mian strode in the direction Yang Chendong left. Tiger's Mane shuddered and followed closely. He also wanted to see if Yu Mian could persuade the young master. If that was the case, it would at least prove that their decision this time was not wrong. Yang Chendong had just returned to the palace of the first city to wash his face. Just as he was about to go to the bedroom to have a comfortable sleep, Beta Persei came to report that Yu Mian wanted to see him. No, the young master is tired. Yang Chendong waved his hand. Of course, he knew what Yu Mian was going to say. He really did not want to argue with him now. It was not scary for a person to make a mistake. What was scary was not realizing one's mistake at all. However, seeing that his father was Yu Qian, he did not have the intention to argue with him. Young master, you'd better meet him. Governor Yu is kneeling outside the door. He said that if you don't meet him, he will kneel there until he dies. Beta Persei scratched his head and said with a headache. This Yu Mian is really pedantic. After Yang Chendong heard this, he knew that he would not be able to sleep. He knew that the imperial censors of the great Ming dynasty were very powerful. Some of them were not even afraid of death in order to help the emperor. On the contrary, some people were proud of it. Even if the emperor ordered them to be killed, They were still excited that they could be written in the history books. Yang Chidong could not understand this at all. If this was not lunacy, then what was? However, he had not experienced it in all these years, so he thought that it was just a legend. Now, there was finally one. Sigh. After a sigh, Yang Chidong knew that he had to meet this person. Let him in. Yang Chidong had no choice but to tidy up his clothes and said helplessly, "Young master, Tiger Man is also kneeling outside." "Look!" Beta Persei reminded carefully. "Come in, come in." One was to raise, two was also to let go. Yang Chidong decided to meet them and see what they had to say. Beta Persei walked out after receiving the order. After a while, Yu Mian and Tiger Man walked into the hall. When they saw Yang Chidong, they knelt together. "There's no need to kneel. If you have something to say, just stand up." Yang Chidong kindly dissuaded them. "No, this time I must speak while kneeling." Yu Mian was like a stubborn donkey that would not turn back until it hit a wall. He raised his head and straightened his neck. Okay. If you want to kneel, then kneel." Yang Chidong looked at Yu Mian, who looked like he would die if he did not kneel. He was too lazy to care. As long as the other party was happy, he could do whatever he wanted. Finally, he could kneel on the ground. Yu Mian looked quite happy. He first straightened his body and then said, "King, it was my idea not to send troops to support the Far Eastern region. It has nothing to do with Commander Tiger. This subject believes that the Far Eastern province is too far away. Moreover, half of the year is cold. There is no future for development in such a cold place. It is not worth investing too much in that place. Now that you have decided on the grasslands, you said that there are many mines near the beginning city. Now, what we need to do is to stabilize the situation here, appease the people here, and open up grain fields and mines. We will win step by step. When we are strong enough, it will not be too late to think of a way to go north. King, it has always been a taboo for military personnel to go on an expedition. King, you can't put the army in danger because of your reputation. It is not worth it." As he spoke, Yu Mian knelt on the ground and kowtowed. With just a few kowtows, blood seeped out of his forehead. If not for Tiger's mane, who was at the side, who reacted quickly, the consequences would have been even more serious. This scene opened Yang Chidong's eyes. In the past, he had seen in some history books that some upright officials had done all sorts of courting death in order to make the emperor accept them. However, that was only limited to written records. In this life, he had become Bugnam of Gojoseon, but none of his subordinates had done so. He had attributed everything to his own wisdom. Because he was wise, his subordinates would not oppose his ideas. But now, Yu Mian's actions had let him know that even if he thought that something was right, others would not necessarily think that way. He sighed in his heart. "Do you think that what is right must be right?" Of course, Yang Chidong would not say such words out loud. It would hurt the hearts of his subjects, and it was not something a ruler would do. What he wanted to do now was not to reprimand, but to reason. Using reason to convince the other party was using virtue to convince them. "Ahem, Yu Mian, you said that the Far Eastern Prefecture is a bitter and cold place. Then let me ask you, wasn't the beginning city a bitter and cold place in the past? When we first invested in building the city here, who would have thought that this place would have such a day? Since the beginning city can create miracles, why can't the Far Eastern Prefecture? It's different. Yu Mian raised his head and said rather firmly, "After all, the beginning city is only at the edge of the grassland. Whether it is by land or by water, it can be considered convenient. Moreover, this place has an extremely important military role. It is worth investing a little more here." Then who can say that the Far Eastern Prefecture has no important military geographical role? Who knows if the Far Eastern Prefecture will be as prosperous as the beginning city one day, or even surpass this place? Yang Chidong, who was familiar with the history of the future, knew very well that what he said was correct because the later generations had used their actions to prove all of this. Yu Mian did not know about this. He just thought that Yang Chidong did all of this for the sake of his reputation. In his opinion, Bugnam of Gojoseon already knew that investing so much manpower and material resources in the Far Eastern Prefecture was a losing deal. It was just that he cared about his reputation and could not admit it. Now, he still had to continue to invest more manpower and financial resources in the Far Eastern Prefecture. This was simply going further and further down the wrong path. As a person who was put in an important position and was also a person who had received kindness, Yumian had to stand up and speak properly. Although the king's reputation was important, he could not make mistakes again and again just because of his reputation and lose so many people and money. Although Yang Chenung's words were true, it was a pity that Yumian, who thought that he had seen through everything, did not think so. Seeing that Yang Chenung was still talking about how good the Far Eastern Prefecture was, Yumian's face showed disbelief. This scene was seen by Yang Chenung. He knew that Yumian did not believe his judgment of the Far Eastern Prefecture at all. Since that was the case, no matter how much he explained, it was useless. He could only use practical actions to slap his face. All right, since City Lord Yu does not believe it, why don't we make a bet? Bet? This subject does not gamble. Yumian shook his head and said with disdain, Your mother. Yang Chendong almost cursed out. In the face of such a stubborn subject like Yumian, he really didn't know what to say. He was even more certain in his heart that he had to put on an act this time and succeed. Otherwise, with this victory, he was afraid that in the future, he would not only have Yumian under his command, but also Wang Mian and Li Mian. At that time, it would be even more difficult to do anything. This would also be a huge blow to his authority, which was something he absolutely did not want to see. No, this time, you have to bet even if you don't want to bet. Within 3 years, if the Far Eastern Prefecture is not self-sufficient and cannot prove its important military geographical position, then it will be considered as this king's loss. In the future, if you have any suggestions, this king will listen carefully and can even give priority to your opinion. But if everything is proven after 3 years, then it will be your loss. At that time, when this king makes any decision, you cannot obstruct or interfere. How about it? Chapter 1370. Yumian's problem had to be solved. Otherwise, there would be endless trouble in the future. Think about it. This time, even Tiger's Mane was persuaded by the other party. Yumian himself did not know what would happen next time. It was only a 3-year time limit. It could be said that Yang Chendong was going all out this time. At least, that was what Yumian thought. It was only 3 years. So what if Bugnam of Gojoseon caused trouble for 3 years? Once he failed, there would not be such a rash thing in the future. It was worth it no matter how one looked at it. As for whether the 6th young master would win or not, Yumian did not consider it. He was involved in every bit of the construction process of the first city. There was no need to mention how many difficulties there were. This was because the first city was not too far away from Liaodong and Baiming's capital, so he could get help for everything he needed. Of course, the Far Eastern region would also receive the support of Qiqian City. With Bugnam of Gojoseon around, perhaps they would receive more resources. However, so what? After all, it was too far away. Could it really be like the first city? At least, Yumian did not believe it. No matter how one looked at it, this matter was worth a gamble. In the end, Yumian raised his head. Okay, I'll bet. After Yumian agreed to the bet, he could no longer interfere with Yang Chendong's every move. He finally relaxed, and the first thing he did was to sleep. No matter what he wanted to do, he had to have a good body first. This was a prerequisite. Just as Yang Chendong was about to fall asleep, news of his bet with Yumian had also spread. This was naturally Yumian's idea. He was afraid that Yang Chendong would go back on his word. He wanted to make this matter a reality. Yang Chendong did not know about this. Even if he knew, he would not care too much. Since he dared to say it, he was naturally confident that he could win. He slept all the way until night. When Yang Chendong woke up, he was full of energy. Beta Persei also took the opportunity to take a nap. When he saw that Yang Chendong had woken up, he carried a basin of water into the room. While his master was washing his face, he said, "Young master, Commander Tian Hu, Commander Sherbei, and Commander Dai Qua are all here. All right, summon them into the palace to discuss matters." Yang Qindong put down the towel in his hand, a confident smile on his face. After obtaining Yang Qindong's permission, the world's #1 Cavalry Division completed the task of expanding the army in a few months. This was all thanks to Ming's Liaodong cavalry. In the battle with them, they had captured more than 40,000 people. Most of them had been educated and became glorious soldiers in the world's #1 Cavalry Army. After the expansion, the world's #1 Cavalry Army's combat strength had also increased exponentially. With more than 40,000 soldiers, they would not be afraid even if they faced enemies several times their number. Needless to say, they were already humiliated by the fake surrender. They were eager to change themselves through a big battle. They naturally responded to Yang Qindong's summons this time. From the commander to the soldiers, they were all full of fighting spirit. Dai Qua was originally a member of the Far Eastern Army. This time, he was transferred by Yang Qindong. He wanted to take advantage of the other party's familiarity with the situation to enter the Far Eastern region. With the help of this division, they would be able to achieve twice the result with half the effort. When the three saw Yang Qindong in the main hall, they all excitedly saluted. Just from their appearance, they should have made sufficient preparations. "Very good. Looking at your appearance, this king has an idea in his heart." Looking at the three, Yang Qindong also smiled. This was a confident smile. "Presumably you already know about the matter. Tang Xingjuan's change has caused the situation in the Far Eastern region to be unclear. It has also successfully provoked the anger of our 5-star army. This time, this king will personally go and let those who betrayed and dared to be our enemies know the consequences of angering our 5-star army. How about it? Do the three of you have the confidence to enter the Far Eastern region and show the might of our 5-star army?" "Yes," the three answered in unison. Their faces were filled with excitement, and excitement before the big battle. "Haha, good. Let's discuss the matter of sending troops." While Yang Qindong was laughing, Beta Persei had already commanded several black cavalry to carry the map of the Far Eastern region. That night, everyone discussed until late into the night before dispersing. With the provisions prepared by the new army group for the 101st Division, Yang Qindong only rested in the first city for 2 days. Then, he personally led the 2,000 black cavalry, a regiment under Division Commander Dai Qua, and the 1st Division of the 1st Heaven Cavalry Army to the north as the vanguard. Bei would lead the other 4 divisions of the 1st Heaven Cavalry Army, the other 4 regiments under Dai Qua, and the new 2nd Army to wait for the arrival of the supplies from Resin City. This time, Yang Qindong obviously put in a lot of capital. It was said that there were dozens of large ships and 2,000 carriages of supplies transported from Resin City alone. Besides, Yang Qindong also went straight to the north after leaving the first city. He walked along the road that was previously used to transport supplies. The road from the first city to the Far Eastern region was indeed not short, but the road was not that difficult to walk. On the contrary, they had been repairing the road. They even put in a lot of effort to lay railway tracks for some distance, so the speed of the army's progress was not slow. They walked 250 miles on the first day. This was naturally related to the fact that the vanguard army was lightly armed. However, if they did not have the foundation that they had previously laid, they would not be able to reach this speed. Only 3 days later, the vanguard army led by Yang Qindong personally entered the Chitao region. They could already see the shadow of Yablonov Mountain from afar. At this time, the Far Eastern region was like a natural unpolished jade. It had not been exploited or damaged. Looking from afar, the tall mountains and forests were covered in a layer of light green. It was the appearance of the beginning of spring. Due to the climate, the winter in the Far Eastern region came much later than in the great Ming dynasty. Along the way, some places where the sun did not shine could still see a small amount of snow. Just based on this, one could feel the helplessness of the bitter cold. In such a climate, it was no wonder that no one occupied such a large territory. However, all of this would change with the arrival of young Chandong. DaiQue had already left with a regiment of soldiers. As the vanguard of the vanguard, he had to find Commander Chen Bo in the fastest way possible. Relatively speaking, the vanguard army led by Yang Chandong did not need to be in such a hurry. They only needed to follow the marks left by the other party. As the army entered the mountain range, the road became more and more difficult to travel. In the past, he had only read on the telegram that 2/3 of the supplies sent to support the far eastern region would be consumed on the way because of the road and distance. Yang Chandong did not believe it, but after personally making a trip, he had a deeper understanding of this. He also finally knew why Yu Mian would take such a big risk to stop him from supporting the far eastern region. "Is the road difficult? Full of difficulties?" Yang Chandong snorted. He liked challenges. If the mission was too easy to complete, it would lose its meaning. Just like in his previous life, sometimes in order to complete a task given by his superior, he could hide in a place without moving or eating for 36 hours. Compared to the hardships he had to endure back then, the hardships he was going through now were nothing. "Send a telegram to Commander Shibi. Tell him to open up a path for the army. It shouldn't be too wide, but it should pass through the carriages first." If one wanted to be rich, one had to build a road first. This was a truth that could be used anywhere. The biggest obstacle preventing the development of the Far Eastern region was the transportation. If this problem could not be solved, then everything else was useless. After talking about the path, the vanguard army continued forward. After passing Yablonov Mountain, they saw the Stanov Mountain range. After a few days, they saw the Arden River. At this point, the scouts in the vanguard finally sent news that they had seen signs of human habitation. Beside the Arden River, the water plants had already developed from light green to dark green. It was also close to the water source. This kind of place was often the favorite environment of herders. It was reasonable to see humans in this kind of place. There weren't many people on the other side, at most 100 or so. When Yang Chandong led the vanguard to the riverside, the originally busy herdsmen panicked. The screams of women, the cries of children, and some young men had already rushed out of the tents with daggers in their hands, standing together at the outermost circle. Herders had their own rules. Once they encountered an unknown situation, the young men in the tribe would habitually protect the elderly, women, and children in the middle. This way, they could better protect the tribe in battle. Under normal circumstances, even if these young men were all killed, the elderly, women, and children would not be in any danger. They would only become the slaves of another tribe. It was the same everywhere. If one wanted to survive, they would always need a large number of people. Sometimes, the result of leading two tribes directly to war was just to snatch the population. Sometimes, a woman would be snatched more than a dozen times from her youth to her old age, so much so that she would forget who the first leader of the tribe was. The sudden appearance of the 5-star army, each riding a tall horse and holding a sharp saber in their hands, caused the young men of this small tribe to show fear and powerlessness. When one side's strength was thousands of times stronger than the other side, there was no need to fight this war. This also caused them to feel despair. "Army, stop advancing!" Beta Persei shouted after receiving the order. As soon as his loud voice came out, the cavalry warriors of the 1st Division of the world's cavalry army all stopped. Chapter 1371. "Army, set up camp here!" It was still Beta Persei's loud voice that reverberated through the air. It was good to have Beta Persei. At least he didn't need to use a loudspeaker to pass down orders. The 5-star army cavalry stopped, and so did the Black Cavalry. Only Yang Chandong, Beta Persei, Tian Hu, and Ba Dao Jiang rode their horses towards the herdsman's tent that was surrounded. The reason why it was called a tent and not a yurt was because these herdsmen were not of Mongolian descent. They were authentic Russian people with white skin. Among the crowd, other than Yang Chandong, it was the first time the other three had seen authentic Caucasians. They couldn't help but look at them curiously. However, Yang Chandong's expression was calm. He rode to the outermost periphery and looked at the 20 or so young men and asked, Hello, can you speak Chinese? Of course, this sentence was spoken in Russian. In his previous life, although Yang Chendong entered the military very early and didn't have the opportunity to further his studies in university, he was very familiar with the languages and cultures of various countries. This was what people meant when they said that reading 10,000 books was not as good as walking 10,000 miles. Yes, we can speak. One of the young men, who was more than 8 feet tall, looked at Yang Chendong with some vigilance and answered. Very good. Yang Chendong didn't want to speak in bird language. It would be great if the other party could speak Chinese. He smiled and nodded. Then I'll have to trouble you to take me to see your patriarch. Don't worry, I have no ill intentions. As he said this, Yang Chendong deliberately spread out his hands to show that he didn't have any weapons. He looked harmless and friendly. In fact, Yang Chendong really didn't have any intention of doing anything to these people. Unless they were hostile forces, otherwise Yang Chendong would treat everyone he met here as his quasi-citizens. He could become a member of Yangtze at any time. How could he do something that would harm his own strength? Yang Chendong spoke politely, but the young man knew that he had no other choice. Seeing that the other party had over 10,000 cavalrymen, they didn't even need to lift a finger to deal with the 20 of them. All they needed to do was to spit at them. However, they didn't take action immediately. Instead, they wanted to settle the problem peacefully. This was already giving them a lot of face. Please! Knowing that he had no other choice, the young man nodded in the end. He then turned around and led Yang Chendong back to the tribe's tent. Yang Chendong's party still had 4 people, and they were moving forward at a moderate pace. Although there were only 4 of them, each of them was more powerful than the other. Even if there were 10 times more of them, they would not be afraid, not to mention that there were only 20 or so saber-wielding youngsters. It was only a tribe of about 100 people. Their territory was not large. After traveling for tens of meters, they arrived at a tent that seemed to be in good condition. Yang Chendong happily dismounted from his horse and looked at the unguarded tent. He asked, Here? Yes. The young man just nodded and didn't make much of an introduction. Then he looked at Yang Chendong with his big eyes. Obviously, he was paying attention to his every move. Hee. Yang Chendong chuckled, thinking in his heart, is this a test of my courage? Does he need to get a group of executioners to throw cups as a signal? But I don't think a small tribe like this has such strength. Yang Chendong, who didn't want to be looked down upon, decided to enter the tent to take a look. Beta Persei wanted to rush in first to observe the environment, but he was stopped by him. The 5-star army suddenly appeared here, so it was impossible for the other party to set up an ambush. And even if there was, with his strength as a Grand Master, why would he be afraid? Under the slightly scrutinizing gaze of the white man, Yang Chendong casually lifted the curtain and walked in empty-handed. Just this boldness alone made the white man nod involuntarily. In his heart, his impression of Yang Chendong increased by a lot. He lifted the curtain and entered the tent. The first thing that caught his eye was a warm breath. With just a quick glance, Yang Chendong calculated that there were at least 30 people in the tent. Among them, women and children were the most, and the elderly were the least. Among them, the old man sitting in the middle of the tent stood out even more. Unlike the other people in the tent, when the other people's faces were filled with fear, the old man in the tent was calmly looking at Yang Chendong. Yang Chendong was also looking at the old man. He had a feeling that this old man must have a story. At least, he should have seen a lot of life and death situations. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so calm. Both sides were looking at each other, but no one spoke first. After about 10 breaths of time, Beta Persei finally couldn't help but shout outside the tent. Young master, are you okay? I'm fine, go get some food and drink and send it in, Yang Chendong said without turning his head. Then he strode towards the old man and said with a smile on his face, How should I address you, sir? The old man had never seen such a calm and collected person entering the tent alone in his entire life. Unconsciously, he put away a short knife hidden in his sleeve and forced a smile on his face. I'm Jurovsky, the chief of these people. How should I address you, sir? Yang Chenong could indeed be called a distinguished guest. Just the golden robe on his body was not ordinary. It was dazzling. So it's the chief of a tribe. Sorry for the disrespect. My name is Yang Chenong, and the people on the grassland also call me Tian Khan. Yang Chenong chuckled and strode to the old man's side. Then, he casually sat down cross-legged. The moment the Heavenly Khan's name was mentioned, the expressions of everyone in the tent changed. Then, all sorts of fear and dread filled their faces once again. The name Tian Khan was now only used on the Mongols. As the Russians who had been ruled by the Mongols for more than 200 years, they both hated and feared them. It was not an exaggeration to say that many times the words, "Mongols are here," could stop babies from crying. Yang Chenong saw everyone's reaction, and he wanted to explain something. However, before he could speak, the chief called Jurovsky spoke first. Don't panic. He's different from ordinary Mongols." The chief said this in Russian, so Yang Chenong naturally heard it clearly. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "Why am I different from other Mongols? You can understand Russian?" The old man was shocked at first, but he quickly calmed down. It was obvious that in this area, the Russians and Mongols interacted with each other, and there was no distinction between them. The language was also a little messy. Just like how the Russians could speak Chinese and Mongolian, why couldn't they speak Russian? After the old man's reprimand, the tent quietened down. The chief looked at Yang Chenong and asked, "Tian Khan? Forgive this old man for being slow, but it seems that other than the noble Genghis Khan, no one else dares to use this name." "That's right." Yang Chenong smiled and nodded. He did not expect the chieftain to be so knowledgeable. However, there was one thing he had to correct. "I am not a Mongol. I am a Han Chinese. The title Heavenly Khan is a form of respect for me." "You're not a Mongol? You're a Han?" Jurovsky's face flashed with surprise for the first time. Then, he thought of something and asked, "But what's the relationship between the Tian Khan and the Han people in the Far East?" He didn't expect the old man to know about the Han people in the Far East. Yang Chenong was also interested. "You know about them?" "That's right, we're together." When he heard Yang Chenong admit it, the chief's expression relaxed a little. He then said, "I've been to the Far East before. I even moved stones there, and helped build the city. I even received some wages. The Han people there are not bad." "Wages? Not bad?" Yang Chenong didn't understand this information. Since the old man had been to the Far East, why didn't he live there? This was much better than wandering around. With doubts in his heart, Yang Chenong asked, "I didn't expect the chief to have help there. But what's your impression of the place?" "Impression?" The chief seemed to recall and said, "It's not bad. At least they don't discriminate against us Russians. We're paid well. Although it's not as much as the Han people, it's still not bad. The city is very grand, but they don't allow us to live there. It's a pity." "They don't allow you to live there?" It was the first time Yang Chenong heard about this. He couldn't help but tremble. "Yes, they don't allow us to live there. They say we're not Han people." When Jurovsky said this, his expression became a little gloomy. Hearing this, Yang Chenong smiled bitterly in his heart. He had told Chenbo that those who weren't of his race would have different intentions. However, it didn't mean that other people were not allowed to live in the city except for the Han people. Just like the beginning city, not all of the people living there were Han people. Many of them were from various Mongolian tribes. Even foreign merchants who came from afar were allowed to live in the city. As long as they could prove their identity and were not hostile or dangerous, they had the right to live in the city. The only difference was that they had to pay a higher price than the Han people. Yang Chenong knew why the Far East hadn't developed in the past few years. It must be because the policy was wrong. Speaking of Chenbo, his ability to lead an army and fight a war was not bad. However, he was better at persuading people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have become one of the earliest political commissars in the Cold Front. It was a pity that he didn't have the experience of building a city, nor did he have the opportunity to learn. He just did it based on his own ideas. It was inevitable that he would take a lot of wrong paths. He also didn't know how to mobilize the people and how to rely on the people to build a base. Chapter 1372. Thinking of this, Yang Chendong was even more confident about the 3-year agreement. In the past, he couldn't find the root of the problem, but now, he knew where the mistake was. As long as he corrected it, the development of the Far Eastern Prefecture would improve. Perhaps in less than 3 years, everything would change, and the Yang faction would have another large base of operations. If he wanted to change, he had to start with himself. Thinking of this, Yang Chendong stood up. Seeing Jurovsky's confused look, Yang Chendong stood up and bowed to him. This bow frightened Jurovsky. He would never forget that the Heavenly Khan had 10,000 cavalrymen just outside the tent. Now that he was on the chopping block, how could he accept such a great bow? Jurovsky wanted to get up and move out of the way, but Yang Chendong had already turned around and bowed to everyone in the tent. His voice rang out. What happened in the Far Eastern region was unfair to everyone. Since I, the Heavenly Khan, am here, I naturally have to change. Like this, if you want to settle down in the Far Eastern region in the future, you can come at any time. I swear in the name of the Heavenly Khan that when that time comes, as long as you are willing, you can live in the city. No one will chase you away. The so-called relying on the people to establish a base. It referred to uniting more people to fight against the enemy. Of course, it was not only the Hans who would unite, but also the local natives, the nearby Russians, and the Mongols who were willing to turn over a new leaf. In fact, uniting more people meant uniting more people who were willing to stop fighting, willing to work for peace, and willing to work for a better future. As long as they were willing, regardless of race, skin color, or region, they would unite together. Only then could the Far Eastern region gain the strongest influence in the shortest time possible, and establish a firm foothold. As for the problem of those who were not of the same race, that would be treated differently in the future. It would be fine as long as they did not give the foreign races more power and status. This did not mean that all the foreign races were enemies. If that was the case, there would be no need to talk about unifying the world. Furthermore, without the foreign races as a foil, how could the Hans show off their noble status? It was like returning home in glory. He had to let more people know about it. Otherwise, it would lose its original meaning of traveling in the night. What? Upon seeing Yang Chendong's vow, Jurovsky's eyes widened as he stared at Yang Chendong in disbelief. In addition to shock, there was also doubt in his eyes. Yang Chendong looked like he was in his 30s, and because his martial realm had reached the Grand Master realm, he looked even younger. Could such a young man really do what he said? Most importantly, he didn't have the final say. Yang Chendong seemed to have noticed the doubt in the other party's eyes. He chuckled and said, "Yes or no, the chief only needs to go to the Far Eastern Prefecture to take a look." Jerevs nodded. "That's right, whether it's real or fake, we'll know when the time comes." At this moment, the curtain of the tent opened from the outside, and Beta Persei, Ba Daojiang, and Tian Hu walked into the tent with a pile of food. As long as the conditions were met, Yang Chendong would never wrong himself. This time, not only did he bring military provisions like compressed biscuits, but he also brought instant noodles, ham sausages, various canned food, and cigarettes. As the three of them entered, all kinds of food were quickly piled up together. These beautifully packaged food were all things that Jurovsky and his people had never seen before. "Come, have a taste." Yang Chendong took a ham sausage with a smile on his face, tore it open, and chewed it in his mouth. There were also some canned food, and after opening it, the aroma overflowed. Soon, the sound of people swallowing their saliva could be heard in the tent. The elderly and women could still restrain themselves as much as possible, but the children couldn't. Originally, because of the heavy snow, they ran out of food a long time ago. They mainly relied on catching some small fish by the river and killing some sheep and horses. How could they have seen such a dazzling array of good food? "Eat as much as you want, this is originally for you." Yang Qinong couldn't help but chuckle when he saw the children's longing eyes and the adults' forceful control of their gazes. However, the children didn't move. Although some of them were already drooling, they still controlled themselves and only looked at Chief Jurovsky. "Let's eat," Jurovsky said after a slight hesitation. Although he didn't know why the Heavenly Khan was so good to him, since the food was already in front of him, it would be a waste if he didn't eat it. Even if there was danger, he could die with a full stomach, right? After receiving permission, the children rushed towards the pile of food until their hands could no longer carry anything else. Then, they hurriedly returned to their mother's side. What followed was the sound of wolfing down the food. At this moment, even people who didn't have an appetite would feel hungry after seeing the children's performance. With food as a bridge, Yang Qindong quickly became friends with Jurovsky and the others. After 2 crude cigars were lit and placed in their mouths, Jurovsky no longer had any guard against Yang Qindong. Yang Qindong smiled. The first step was to remove their guard, and the second step was to strengthen their relationship. The next step was to integrate everyone and become one of them. Yang Qindong naturally had his own way of doing this. Simply put, it was nothing more than bait. Humans die for wealth, and birds die for food. After a person filled their stomach, the next thing to consider was how to obtain more wealth so that they wouldn't starve anymore. Yang Qindong, who was very clear about the hearts of these herdsmen, used his trump card, silver. When Yang Qindong explained to Jurovsky that in the future, people other than the Han people would be allowed to live in the Far Eastern region, and not only that, as long as they acknowledged and returned to the Far Eastern region, they would be able to obtain an identity certificate, be allocated farmland, have a job, and have their own house. Jurovsky's eyes lit up when he heard this. Because of the geographical climate, the Far Eastern region was indeed vast and sparsely populated. However, this didn't mean that there were no people here. It was just that the place was too big and there were too many people, so it didn't attract much attention. However, if one were to count carefully, the population here would be at least a few 100,000, or even more. There were countless mountains, forests, and lakes here. There were wild beasts in the mountains and fresh fish in the lakes. These were all things that could fill one's stomach. Compared to the grassland, which only had green grass, it was many times better. Thus, this place had always been very attractive. The reason why people didn't come here was because the winter was too cold, and there was no guarantee of safety. However, if they had a place like the Far Eastern region, they would have their own house. Winter wouldn't be so cold, and there would be more guarantee of safety. Thus, how could such a place not be attractive? After hearing Yang Qindong's words, Jurovsky nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Khan Tian. Don't worry, I will do my best to tell this good news to the other tribes." Yang Qindong was in a good mood after persuading Jurovsky without much effort. Then, he casually asked if anything special had happened in this place recently. This was just a casual question. Yang Qindong didn't think that Jurovsky would know anything. After all, they still didn't know that there was a mutiny in the Far Eastern region. Naturally, they wouldn't know too much about the outside world. What was unexpected was that this was just a casual question, but he actually managed to get some information out of it. Jurovsky actually said something strange. "Heavenly Khan, it's not far from here by the Amuga River. Our tribesmen accidentally saw a group of Mongolian cavalry stationed there." "Mongol cavalry?" When he heard this, Yang Qindong's eyes lit up. He immediately asked, "How many people?" "A few hundred. You can ask Nikolaev for the specifics. He was the one who saw it." After saying this, Jurovsky said something to a woman beside him. The woman nodded and left. Not long after, Nikolaev walked into the tent. Nikolaev was the leader of the young people who blocked the 5-star army. However, when he saw Yang Qindong this time, there was no longer any hostility in his eyes. Instead, there was only gratitude. He was oppressed and ruled by the Mongols since he was born. He lived like an ordinary person. Nikolaev's biggest wish was to be able to eat a full meal. Later, he slowly grew up, but this small wish was never fulfilled. After marrying and having children with his wife, who was also of the lower class, he placed this wish on his son. He only hoped that one day, his son would be able to eat a full meal. Then, even if he died, he would be able to close his eyes. Today, this wish was finally fulfilled. Just now, he saw his only son eat a lot of food until he couldn't eat anymore. When he was about to vomit, he cried. Ever since he was young, no matter what difficulties he encountered, even if he didn't eat for a few days, he had never cried. He still used all his strength to fight against fate. However, when he saw his son eat a full meal and his stomach bulge, he finally couldn't control his tears. He felt that his life was worth it. His wish was fulfilled. It was all thanks to Yang Chendong. Now that his benefactor had something to ask him, he naturally didn't hide anything. He told Yang Chendong about how he saw a group of Mongol cavalry a few days ago when he wanted to make something for his son to eat. Chapter 1373. There are about 300 of them. Everyone is riding a horse and carrying a sword. They are like the Khan's soldiers. No! They are not as strong as the Khan's soldiers. Many of them look like they are emaciated and their clothes are old. As a poor man, Nikolaev was very attentive to details. After his description and Jurovsky's judgment, he finally determined that these people should be the Mongolian cavalry. Looking at their flags, they should belong to the Khan of Siberia's soldiers and should be in the reconnaissance category. This should be a group of Mongolian cavalry. Their mission was to be in charge of guarding the perimeter while keeping an eye on any suspicious targets. Once confirmed, they would call their friends and surround them. Phew! Yang Chendong let out a sigh of relief. With just this group of Mongolian cavalry, Yang Chendong could at least conclude that Chen Bo and the others were fine. Otherwise, these cavalrymen under the Siberian Khan wouldn't be so careful and set the perimeter so far away. Are you willing to take us to find these Mongolian cavalry? Since he knew the whereabouts of the enemy, Yang Chendong naturally would not let it go so easily. His gaze fell on the young man Nikolaev and asked. Nikolaev's face was a little nervous, but his answer was still straightforward. Yes, I am willing to serve the Khan. He did not understand the 5-star army, nor did he understand Yang Chendong. Nikolaev did not know what the consequences would be if he refused. If he angered the Khan, he was afraid that a simple order would be enough to kill all of his people. Good. Come, take out some refined salt and sword for our friends. After Yang Chendong received a satisfactory answer, he laughed and waved his hand. Beta Persei turned around and left. Not long after, he brought the black cavalry to Chief Jurovsky with a few bags of well-packed refined salt and weapons. Refined salt, high-quality refined salt. Jurovsky unceremoniously opened the bag with the dagger in his hand. When he put his finger back into his mouth, he couldn't help but shout excitedly. In ancient times, salt and iron had always been the exclusive property of those in power. It was also one of the items that would not be exported or traded. And in remote places like the Far East, it was impossible to see them. Occasionally, some table salt would appear, but it was also coarse salt. Not only was its quality extremely poor, there were also many impurities in it. Good quality ones could be exchanged for several horses and sheep in one bag. Even so, it was not easy to get some. They were treated as treasures by the tribes. Yang Chendong had given him 4 bags, and each bag weighed at least 50 pounds. That was more than 200 pounds, and Jurovsky couldn't help but be excited. Jurovsky wasn't the only one who was excited. Nicholas and the others were also very excited. At this time, when they looked at Yang Chendong, there was a hint of trust in their eyes. With just this salt and iron, what was the point of selling their lives to the other party? It had to be said that in such a remote and bitter place, a human's life was the most worthless existence. Sometimes, for a mouthful of food, there would be people who would sell their dignity, strength, and life. Yang Chendong was willing to give out these things. In a sense, Nicholas' life already belonged to him. Without disturbing the celebration of this small tribe, Yang Chendong left the place. While ordering the army to rest, he also called Commander Tian Hu over and told him to prepare to send out a group of cavalry to follow Nicholas to the Amurga River and take down the hundreds of Mongol cavalry. Just treat it as interest. Thinking about how the Far East province had suffered heavy losses from the surprise attack, a murderous intent flashed across young Chandong's eyes. It had always been him finding trouble with others. Since someone dared to provoke him, he definitely couldn't let them go. That night, this small Russian tribe didn't sleep at all. They surrounded the salt and iron just like that. Some of the young men also changed their rusty iron weapons under Juravsky's orders and took out sharp cavalry swords. At this time, the things that Yang Chandong gave them were the hope of their tribe. They definitely couldn't lose them. Nicholas wasn't part of the people protecting the salt and iron. Not only him, but there were also 4 other people who didn't participate in the guard duty last night. Under Juravsky's orders, they had a good night's rest. Today, they would follow the Heavenly Khan to deal with the Mongol cavalry. When Yang Chandong walked out of the tent in the morning, he was also full of energy. After reaching the Grand Master realm, Yang Chandong could sleep peacefully in any environment as long as he wanted to. This was one of the main reasons why he was full of energy. Tian, who had already brought 1,000 cavalry and was ready to set off at any time. This time, he was going to personally lead the army to kill the enemy, leaving behind Division Commander Taimur with a sad expression. Nicholas had breakfast with the soldiers of the 5-star army, and he saw a satisfied look on the faces of the 5 soldiers. To them, they had never eaten such a delicious breakfast in their lives, let alone enough to fill their stomachs. When Nicholas and the others looked at the 5-star army soldiers after breakfast, their eyes were filled with envy. Beside the Amugya River, there were many military tents here, and from time to time, one could see men in Mongol clothing walking back and forth. Sometimes, they would even patrol around the river. Just as Yang Chandong expected, this was the Siberian Khan's cavalry unit. Their mission was to be in charge of the safety of this area, and at the same time, to see if there were any enemies from the Far East who escaped from here. However, their gazes were mostly on the inner side, and they did not pay much attention to the south of the Amugya River. In their eyes, the enemy was in the north, not the south. As for whether or not someone would attack them from the south, it was not a problem for them to consider. There were 300 Mongol cavalry here. Although they were not elites, they were not something that anyone could target. For example, if Chieftain Juravsky's 100-man tribe encountered them, they would probably run as far away as possible. If they wanted to face 300 Mongol cavalry who lived on horses all year round, they would need at least 1,000 cavalry to dare to take the risk. This was where Ahachi's confidence came from. As the general of the 300 cavalrymen, he had never thought that anyone would harm him. All he thought about was how to find the Far East army that had escaped, and then strike at them to gain merit. As such, when Yang Chandong brought 500 black cavalry units to the south of the Amugya River, Ahiki, who received the news, did not panic. Instead, he calmly walked out of the tent. When his subordinates reported that there was a cavalry unit in black armor outside the tent, Ahiki did not believe it and thought that it was an exaggeration. No matter if it was in Siberia or the Far East, iron was hard to find. If a normal person could get a good weapon, they would be proud of it for a long time. Who would be able to make armor out of iron? That was not a waste, but a luxury. Even the personal guards of Khan Hulahan only had leather armor on their upper bodies, which was already very enviable. With this belief, Ahiki walked out of the tent. As expected, he saw a sea of black armor, and his eyes were filled with greed. Even though there were 500 cavalry, far more than the 300 he brought with him, there was no fear in his eyes. However, there was no trace of fear in Ahachi's eyes. Perhaps it was because he had not had an opponent for many years, but he was used to treating everyone as prey. Even if there were 500 Black Knight Dragon Guards, he still thought the same. He was already used to treating this area as his own backyard. Ahiki did not think that there was anyone he could not defeat. Even if there were more enemies than him, and their equipment was better than his, it was still the same. War is not about who has better equipment, Ahiki muttered to himself. He then raised his right hand above his head and shouted, "All troops, gather!" The 300 Mongolian cavalry had already gotten on their horses. When they heard the general's order, they quickly gathered around Ahiki in groups of 10. It was said that small details revealed true ability. Just based on how quickly the Mongolian cavaliers gathered together, this was a group of well-trained cavaliers. This was especially so when there was a rare look of fearlessness in their eyes, and this was something that was rarely seen among the five-star armies. Ha! Yang Chidong, who was riding on the white dragon, also laughed. He did not think that there was anything special about this Mongolian cavalry. He had seen many such opponents, and the strongest was the Walla cavalry led by Yesen. But what was the result? Didn't they still lose at his hands? They had once looked down on the five-star army, but reality would give them a slap in the face. He also did not think that this Mongolian cavalry was that strong. Young Master Yang Er, who had been following Wang Chong from the side, had an excited expression on his face. It was rare for him to encounter an opponent who did not run away. Although there were only 300 of them, they had successfully aroused Yang Er's fighting spirit. I'll give you 100 long way. Go. Yang Chidong said casually as if he was talking about something very normal. The black cavalry moved out. Under Beta Persei's lead and Ba Dao Zhang's support, a group of 102 cavalry jumped over the Amurga River and headed straight for their target. Nicholas and the other 4 also wanted to urge their horses forward, but they were stopped by Cho Wu, who was standing at the side. This made the 5 of them puzzled. Did they not need to fight? After Yang Chindong took out a large amount of salt and iron to give to his tribe, Nicholas and the other 4 had already sold their lives to the five-star army. They were even prepared to be members of the five-star army. This was the rule. After receiving benefits from others, they naturally had to work for them. Chapter 1374. The 5 of them were even prepared to die in battle. However, when Chiovi stopped them, the 5 of them realized that the five-star army was different from other armies. They did not need them to risk their lives. Could it be that they were really helping their tribe for free? The other 4 people were led by Nikoliv. After being stopped, their gazes naturally fell on him. Let's wait and see. Nikoliv, who was also at a loss, could only say this. At the same time, he looked at the battlefield. He could not understand why the five-star army only sent out 100 cavalry even though they had more people. What was the reason for this? Very quickly, Nikoliv had an answer. Everything that happened on the battlefield told him that there was only one reason why the five-star army only sent out 100 cavalry. These Mongol cavalry were not worth sending out more cavalry. The black cavalry leaped over the river and the distance between the 2 sides was getting closer and closer. When they were less than 4 li away, Ahichi shouted, 100 cavalry on each side, charge! Ahichi thought that he had seen through the situation and that the enemy had sent out 100 cavalry to test the waters. This was his chance. He only needed to kill these 100 cavalry as quickly as possible and take advantage of the fact that the enemy had not reacted to the situation to kill them. Then, the situation would be settled. When he thought about how the enemy's black armor would increase his army's combat strength by at least 50%, he began to laugh maniacally. It was truly a blessing from the gods that such a good preparation was placed in front of him. There was no reason for him not to accept it. On the battlefield, the 200 Mongol cavalry shouted and made all sorts of noises. They spread out and surrounded the 100 black cavalry. Although there were only 200 of them, because their formation was too spread out, it actually gave off a strong momentum. They either went towards the left wing or the right wing. Some even went towards the middle. The sabers in their hands continuously spun as they prepared to strike. On the other hand, the 100 black cavalry soldiers also spread out. With Beta Persei, Ba Dao Jiang, Pingyu, and the others at the tip of the arrows, they formed groups of around a dozen people, and they tore through the air like arrows that left their bows. They headed straight for Ahichi, who was protected by 100 Mongolian cavaliers. It was as if no matter where the wind blew, he would just go all the way. Fire! Fire! Ahichi's face revealed a trace of panic when he saw that the incoming enemy did not care about being surrounded and instead went straight for the root of the problem. Although there were only 100 of them, for some reason, they gave him a great sense of pressure. It was like being stared at by a wild beast on a grassland. With a command, the 100 cavalrymen beside him quickly took out their strong bows, knocked their arrows, and began to shoot. Whoosh, 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 arrows pierced through the air unceasingly, their target being the 100 black cavalry soldiers who were charging straight at them. At the same time, a large number of Mongolian cavaliers also surged in from the left and right of the black cavalry. It was not an exaggeration to say that there was an ambush from all sides. At that moment, the black cavalry had already met with dozens of Mongolian cavaliers in front of them. Their black clothes and black armor allowed them to ignore normal arrows. At that moment, they only needed to swing their swords and kill the enemies who were charging at them. Clang, clang, clang. The Black Knight Dragon Guards did not show any signs of slowing down, nor did they make any movements to dodge. They allowed the arrows to hit their bodies, and the sound of metal clashing could be heard. Then, the sabers in their hands clashed with the sabers of the Mongolian cavalry in front of them. Then, an unbelievable scene appeared. The Mongolian cavaliers who were riding on their horses with ferocious expressions were stunned on the spot. It was as if their acupoints had been sealed. They did not move at all and allowed the black cavalry soldiers beside them to jump past them as if they did not know what was going on. This scene shocked Nikolaev, who was watching the battle. This scene shocked Ahachi, who was commanding the battle. This scene shocked the Mongolian cavaliers who were flanking them from the left and right. A scene that should not have happened on the battlefield happened just like that. But everyone knew that swords and sabers had no eyes on the battlefield. Often, the outcome of a battle could be decided in an instant. There was absolutely no room for the slightest bit of absent-mindedness or carelessness because it often meant that one was already walking together with the god of death. But now, it was not just one Mongolian cavalier, but dozens of Mongolian cavaliers who were standing there. It was as if a spell had been cast on them, and they did not move at all. This scene was so real that it caused everyone who saw it to have a big question in their hearts. They could not help but ask in their hearts, "What is going on? What is going on now?" While most people were still confused, Beta Persei led the black cavalry and did not stop charging forward. They continued to charge forward bravely, and soon, they reached Ahachi's camp and stood in front of the Mongolian general. "Kill!" Ahachi was also puzzled as to why his cavaliers did not move. However, with the enemy before them, he could not care so much. He clamped his legs on his horse and rode forward with his saber raised. Dang, dang, dang! When the two sides came into contact, they exchanged 3 saber blows in an extremely short period of time. Only the most elite cavaliers could achieve such a speed. Only the veterans who were one with their horses could do it so skillfully. The black cavalry slashed 3 times in a short period of time. Ahachi and the others who were passively defending also blocked 3 saber blows. A huge force traveled down the saber to their arms, causing the arms of the 100 Mongolian cavaliers to tremble uncontrollably. Shock rose in their hearts. Not only was the speed of their opponent's saber extremely fast, the strength was also extraordinary. He was definitely a tough opponent. Before the shock in their hearts could completely disappear, an even more shocking scene appeared. After blocking the 3 slashes, they were shocked to find that the sabers in their hands had actually broken into 2. This sudden scene shocked everyone, causing them to be at a loss for what to do. They were completely shocked, just like the dozens of Mongolian riders earlier. Their minds were blank as they sat on their horses, forgetting everything. How could they have known that the black cavalry dragon guards had already changed their weapons to divine sabers? This was something that Yang Chundong had specially brought out from the military factory in Crimson City. As Yang Xia gained more and more iron ore, his forging skills continued to improve. The quality of the sabers also increased greatly. Every new divine saber lived up to its name. Not only were the sabers thinner and lighter than normal sabers, they were also sharper and had reached a state where they could cut through iron like mud. In just 3 saber blows, they were able to cut the enemy's saber in half. This showed how powerful and tough the saber was. "Get down from your horses!" Beta Persei and the others, who had succeeded in one strike, reined in their horses. Then, They swung their arms and used the backs of their sabers to smack down on the backs of the Mongolian cavaliers who were still standing on their horses with shocked expressions. Under the powerful force, the Mongolian cavaliers who were unable to defend themselves in time fell down from their horses like dumplings. 100 Mongolian cavaliers, including a Hachi, were all captured at the start of the fight. This sudden scene also shocked the Mongolian cavaliers who were charging over from both sides. In their eyes, Ahachi and the others were captured the moment they came into contact with the black cavalry. How did this trick work? They really could not understand it. It was only when the dozens of Mongolian cavaliers who were fighting against the Black Knights and Dragon Guards on the battlefield suddenly shouted and ran in all directions with their broken sabers in hand that the other Mongolian cavaliers noticed that the weapons in their comrades' hands had been broken into two at some point in time. They finally figured out what had happened and why their general had been taken captive in a single encounter. The remaining 100 or so Mongolian cavaliers suddenly changed their direction of charge. They no longer fought against the black cavalry. Instead, they ran in all directions. A group of cavaliers dressed in black armor and equipped with spirit. They could ignore the arrows fired from afar and also had sabers that could cut through iron like mud. This kind of opponent was not someone they could fight against. Since they could not win, they could only run. They had to report this news to the Khan. Not good, they want to run. Nikolaev instinctively shouted and immediately rode out. The scene that had just happened in front of him had stimulated him greatly. In their eyes, they were invincible and there was nothing they could not win. Wherever they appeared, it was as if a gust of wind had swept through and not a single blade of grass grew. Once any of the Russian tribes met them, they would usually run away before the battle even started. Yet, it was precisely such a powerful existence that was unable to withstand a single blow from the Black Knight Dragon Guards. In just a single exchange, the Black Knight Dragon Guards were defeated. This was simply too unbelievable and unbelievable. After the shock, Nikolaev's eyes were filled with killing intent. The Mongolian cavaliers were defeated. Was this not the time for him to collect the blood debt? He thought about how his tribe originally had more than 1,000 people. But after being attacked by the Mongolian cavaliers time and time again, there were only a few hundred people left. How great was this hatred? Even in his dreams, he wanted to take revenge. He could only hate the fact that his strength was limited. Now that the opportunity had finally appeared, how could he let go of this chance to beat the dog in the water? Nikolaev wanted to chase after the enemy, and the 4 companions beside him did the same. However, before they could truly run out, arrows tore through the air and landed on the Mongolian cavalrymen who were trying to escape one after another or on their war horses. Tian, who appeared with 1,000 cavaliers. They had been lying in ambush for a long time in order to surround the enemy and not give anyone a chance to escape. Chapter 1375. Tian, who was very confident in the black cavalry, had been waiting for the moment when they would be defeated and run away. When the opportunity came, he gave the order and the 1,000 cavalrymen under him raised their bows and shot. One after another, the Mongolian cavalrymen fell from their horses and fell to the ground. They fell so hard that they saw stars and lost their sense of direction. Rows of cavalry moved out in an orderly formation from all directions, forming a huge circle that surrounded the 300 Mongolian cavalrymen. It also made some of the Mongolian cavalrymen who had just climbed up from the ground and wanted to escape despair. Capture them all, kill those who resist! After Tian, who was wearing a purple cape, gave the order, the elite cavalrymen under him quickly went forward and restrained the Mongolian cavalrymen who fell to the ground one after another. After 3 Mongolian cavalrymen who wanted to resist with their blades were beheaded and blood splattered 3 feet high, the other Mongolian cavalrymen became obedient. At this moment, all of them had despair in their eyes, and they looked like the commoners who had been surrounded and killed by them. From the beginning to the end of the battle, less than 15 minutes had passed and Beta Persei had already returned to young Chidong. Reporting to young master, in this battle, we killed 12 of the enemy and captured 288 of them. There were no casualties on our side, please give us your orders. Clean up the battlefield and interrogate the prisoners. Yang Chendong's magnetic voice rang out. After Beta Persei gave a military salute, he handed everything to Commander Tian Hu to deal with. Tian Hu, who had been through hundreds of battles, was very familiar with these matters. He quickly came to a Heki and asked about whether there were any more Mongolian cavalrymen nearby. A Heki, who had been beaten silly, had 2 of his fingers mercilessly chopped off by Tian Hu. He screamed and said loudly, I'll talk. In less than 10 minutes, a Heki told him that there was another group of Mongol cavalry 100 miles away beside the Lena River. The 6th young master, he told me that there is a group of 2,000 Mongolian cavalry near the Lena River in the northeast. Their mission is to monitor this area and prevent the Far Eastern Army from breaking out. Tian Hu reported as he walked in front of Yang Chendong. 2,000 cavalrymen? Yang Chendong sneered. Let's go and devour them. Anyone who dared to challenge the 5-star army was an enemy. Yang Chendong would never show mercy to his enemies, not to mention an army of foreign races. Although there were only 1,500 of them, none of them showed fear when Yang Chendong gave the order. From their point of view, it was as if their 1,500 men encircling and eating the 2,000 Mongol cavalry was a matter of course. It was so normal. He left behind a small group of 50 men to watch over a Heki and the other 2 captives. In the blink of an eye, Yang Chendong brought the main force and disappeared from the Amuga River. Lena River. The river was flowing from a high point to a low point. Beside this 30 feet wide river, a number of tents had been set up. Many Mongolian soldiers patrolled with their sabers in hand. Piles of firewood were piled up here, and many fully dressed sheep were placed on the piles of firewood. What a lively scene! The sky was about to turn dark, and bonfires were lit. From the tents at the side, many white-skinned women in tattered clothes walked out. Under the illumination of the fire, everyone's face revealed a terrified expression. These women were all captives of the Mongolian cavalrymen, and they were all women from the nearby Russian tribes. Over the past few days, the Mongol cavalry had appeared like locusts and invaded their homes. They killed all the men in their tribe and captured them. Some of them had lost their fathers, some had lost their husbands, and some had lost their children. Their experiences had caused some of them to feel numb. If not for the fact that they did not have the courage to die, they would have followed in the footsteps of their families. However, although they did not die, they only had a body. Without a soul, without hope, they were just walking corpses. Bring them out and let them dance. If they dance well, they will have food to eat, ha ha ha. A middle-aged man dressed in Mongolian armor laughed out loud. He was the general of the 2,000 Mongolian soldiers, Nanlidi. Ever since he had followed Hulahan from Siberia to the Far East region, he had been living a blissful life every day. In the day, he would lead the cavalrymen to sweep and kill, and at night, he would enjoy the fruits of his labor. Under his small eyes, his gaze carefully swept across the white women. He had already chosen 2 targets who would serve him to sleep tonight. Compared to the life in the Far East region, it was much better than the barren Siberia. There was good wine, beauties, and a Han Chinese army that could be taken as prey at any time. Compared to the Siberia region that they had swept through countless times, this place was simply too rich. Of course, what Nanlidi enjoyed was still a far cry from what Khan Hurahan and General Akmu enjoyed. The other party had taken over the Far Eastern region's capital, Al City. There were hundreds of thousands of people from various races there, and the wealth and beauties were uncountable. Although he was envious in his heart, Nanlidi could only sigh. He knew that his experience was still shallow, and some good things would not be his turn. However, it was not that he did not have any hope. For example, if he could find the hiding place of the Far Eastern Army, it would be a great achievement. It was said that the Far East Army's provisions were hidden in a very secretive place, and only the governor knew where it was. Once he found this person, the merit he would receive would be enough to qualify him to go to Al City. At that time, his treatment would undergo an earth-shattering change. And tomorrow we will send people to search nearby, and expand the search area. However, for now, Of course we have to enjoy it. Ha ha, come on, let them dance. Nanlidi, who was full of expectations for tomorrow, seemed to be filled with yearning and hope. His entire mood seemed to have become even more excited at this moment. The general gave the order, and the women who were chased out of the house were thrown into the inner circle, and under the light of the bonfire, they started to dance the Russian folk dance. Outside, countless Mongolian cavalrymen drank the horse milk wine, ate the whole roasted lamb, and laughed with saliva dripping from their mouths. Some of their gazes were filled with lust when they looked at the scene, as if they were evil children on the grasslands staring at white lambs. The women felt their hearts palpitating, and some of the more timid ones started to cry. They could already imagine what kind of fate would befall them when night fell. Thinking about how they would soon become the bedding of these evil wolf-like people, some of them could not help but start to sob. Everyone would be afraid, and now the Russian women were not only afraid, they had already started to feel fear. This caused their dance to become messy, and it immediately attracted the scolding of some of the Mongolian soldiers. The more nervous one was, the easier it was for them to make mistakes. Finally, one of the girls lost her composure. Especially when she was too direct with the gaze of a Mongolian soldier, she accidentally sprained her ankle and fell to the ground. "Bastard, you can't even dance properly, what's the use of having you?" One of the closest Mongolian soldiers pulled out the scimitar at his waist and walked towards the woman with a ferocious gaze. His body was filled with killing intent, and his gaze was filled with rage. He wanted to kill one as an example, and let all the Russian women know that in front of the brave Mongolian soldiers, they could only listen obediently. Otherwise, only death would await them. The Mongolian soldier stood up, and the Russian women cried out in shock. They hugged each other, but they threw the woman on the ground to the side. In times of danger, the selfish side of humans was fully displayed. Although they were all prey, no one had any intention of standing up for the woman. It was better to live than to die, and this was a truth that could be easily displayed in many ways. All of the girls were trembling in fear, causing the other Mongol soldiers to laugh out loud. They loved to see their prey in fear, and it was as if that was the only way to show off their strength. The Mongolian soldier who stood up had already pulled out the scimitar on his body, and in a few steps, he arrived in front of the Russian woman on the ground. What he saw was a pleading, pitiful, and helpless gaze. However, at this moment, it was as if he did not see it. In these few days he had already killed 2 Russians, and he was no longer afraid of killing. On the contrary, he could even feel a trace of pleasure from it. Sometimes, killing could be addictive, especially when the prey did not dare to resist, and was at his mercy. That kind of feeling was indescribably wonderful. The Mongolian soldier raised the scimitar in his hand, and his face was filled with smiles. Then, he swung the scimitar down, and he could not wait to see the woman covered in blood and struggling on the ground. The other Mongolian soldiers did not move, and it was as if they were already used to this scene. They were still waiting for the scimitar to fall, and as long as this woman died, the other Russian women would definitely be more obedient. Later on, wouldn't they be able to do whatever they wanted, and they would be at their mercy? Unknowingly, everyone's gaze landed on the Mongolian soldier, and they were waiting for what was about to happen. However, 1 breath passed, 2 breaths passed, and that scimitar did not fall. It wasn't until 3 breaths later that someone suddenly shouted, "Where did the bow and arrow come from? Not good, enemy attack!" Under the illumination of the bonfire, an arrow with a trembling tail appeared on the back of the Mongolian soldier. At this moment, a quarter of the arrow had already entered. Previously, because of the angle, no one noticed it, but now that they saw it clearly, some of the experienced soldiers began to shout. Chapter 1376. It was also with this shout that the ground rumbled. It was as if 1,000,000 drums were beating in the hearts of those who heard it, causing many people to be surprised at the first moment. Any veteran who had been on the battlefield could tell that this was the sound of horses galloping on the ground. From the sound of it, there should be a large number of cavalrymen. "Get on your horses, pick up your weapons and follow this general to kill!" Nanlidi also threw the wineskin in his hand to the ground at the first moment, and then he started to make a fuss. He had not heard that the Khan was going to send troops to help him. Furthermore, one of his brothers had already been shot by an arrow. Even if he used his toes to think, he should know that the enemy was not a friend. However, he did not panic. The only enemies in the vicinity were a few scattered Russian tribes. They were few in number and did not have enough horses and weapons. They were not a threat to them. As long as they could withstand the initial attack, it would be time for them to counterattack. As expected of well-trained elite soldiers, under the command of their general, the drunken Mongolian soldiers seemed to have changed. They were all in high spirits as they found their horses and pulled out their scimitars. They looked as if they were ready to enter the battlefield at any time. Rumble, rumble, the sound got closer and closer. Following that, a group of cavalrymen in black clothes and black armor charged towards the Mongolian camp under the protection of another group of cavalrymen in green military uniforms. While they were still far away, the arrows in their hands were fired from afar. When the arrows landed on the tents, they caused a raging fire. The newcomers were the 200 black cavalry led by Ba Daojiang, the vice-captain of the 1st Battalion of Black Cavalry Dragon Guards, as well as the 600 soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Army led by Tian Hu. During the day, the Black Cavalry had been in the limelight by the Amurga River. At night, Tian Hu did not want to be a spectator. He took the initiative to ask for battle, and Yang Chenong allowed him to bring 600 soldiers. As for the other Black Cavalry and the 1st Cavalry Army, they surrounded the perimeter to prevent the enemy from escaping. Before Yang Chenong found the enemy's main force, he did not want his whereabouts to be known by others. When Tian Hu and Ba Daojiang appeared, it was as if a dark cloud had gathered. With the best weapons, the strongest horses, and the strongest physique, the 5-star army charged into the Mongolian camp as soon as they appeared, showing their tyrannical and domineering side. Without any time to prepare, there was no way to counterattack. The 5-star army arrived in front of them. The lit tents and the bonfires on the ground became the guiding lights, illuminating the surroundings and giving the 5-star army directions, allowing them to kill in all directions. One after another, the Mongolian soldiers who had yet to find their horses were hacked to the ground. One after another, the Mongolian soldiers who wanted to counterattack realized that the scimitars in their hands were quickly broken into two, becoming useless objects. One after another, the Mongolian soldiers fell to the ground covered in blood, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. One after another, the Mongolian soldiers watched as the enemy's scimitars slit their necks. They were powerless and helpless. It was as if they had been surrounded by the small Russian tribe. Now they had become the prey, the meat on the fish. Those who resist will be killed without mercy. Those who surrender, throw down your weapons and kneel on the ground, and you will live. Tian Hu held his scimitars, and in a short period of time, he had already cut down 3 Mongolian soldiers. He was filled with killing intent as he watched the Mongolian soldiers in front of him dwindle. Those who surrender will live. Those who resist will die. More and more 5-star army soldiers began to roar. Their voices were transmitted into the ears of the Mongolian soldiers. Some of the Mongolian soldiers who had been frightened pale by the scene in front of them finally put down their weapons. This was simply an unequal battle. One side came prepared, while the other side came unprepared. One side was preparing their troops, while the other side was immersed in wine and women. One side was filled with killing intent, while the other side was filled with fear. One side was like a hot knife through butter, while the other side was defeated like a mountain. Under such a situation, if they continued to resist, they would only die. Just like those Russian girls who knew that it was hard to live, but did not want to die, these Mongolian soldiers were the same. After knowing that they could live if they surrendered, they did not hesitate to choose the latter. With a large number of Mongolian soldiers kneeling and surrendering, the situation on the battlefield became clearer. In less than an hour, the entire battle had ended. Ba Daojiang and Tian Hu began to clean up the battlefield. The Russian girls who had been captured stood together, the Mongolian soldiers who had surrendered squatted together, and the corpses of the Mongolian soldiers who had been killed were carried together. Under the illumination of the flames, the Russian girls looked at their surroundings in panic. To them, the Mongolian soldiers had been defeated, but it did not mean that they were free. No one knew who these Mongolian soldiers were, and whether they had any other intentions. If one were to use a phrase to describe their mentality, it would be that they had just escaped from the wolf's den and entered the tiger's den. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The earth trembled once again, causing the Russian girls, who were already worried about their future, to have a drastic change in expression. Could it be that another cavalry was coming? If that was the case, would they be able to survive the battle? On the other hand, the Mongolian soldiers who had dropped their weapons on the ground were pleasantly surprised. More Mongolian soldiers? Could it be their own people? If that was the case, wouldn't they have a chance to retaliate? Some of the smarter ones could not help but raise their heads and look around. Pucci. With a slash of the saber, a head that was still moving around quickly flew into the air. When the head was separated from the body, blood spurted out and sprayed on the bodies of the surrendered Mongolian soldiers, causing them to tremble uncontrollably. At this moment, they finally realized how ruthless their opponents were. They were even more ruthless than they were. Compared to them who killed without batting an eyelid, these Mongolian soldiers were the demon kings. Don't have any dirty thoughts. Act like you are surrendering. When Ba Daojiang's loud voice rang out, he was wiping the saber in his hand. With such an example, the rest of the Mongol soldiers quickly became obedient. Now, even if the battle cries outside shook the heavens, they did not have the courage to raise their heads. After a series of rumbling sounds, another group of Mongolian soldiers entered the battlefield. Yang Qinong, who was dressed in a golden battle robe, entered the battlefield under the protection of the Black Cavalry and the soldiers of the First Army. Behind them, hundreds of men dressed as Mongolian soldiers were hugging their heads as they walked. Among them was the general of this group of Mongolian soldiers, Nanlidi. When the battle started, the situation was one-sided. When Nanlidi saw that the enemy was not friendly and that they were strong, the first thing he did was not to lead his soldiers to retaliate. Instead, he led the hundreds of elites to escape. At any time, survival was always the most important thing. Nanlidi was thinking that as long as he could escape, he would go to Al City to seek an audience with the Great Khan and ask for more reinforcements to completely eliminate this unknown enemy. With the thought of revenge in mind, Nanlidi decided to endure for now. However, not long after he left the tent, he met Yang Chidong, who had been waiting for him. With an order, the arrows shot out, causing him to feel dizzy. After another wave of cavalry charge, the Mongol soldiers who were already scared out of their wits all laid down their weapons and surrendered. Nanlidi was forced to join them as well. However, even at this time, Nanlidi still had a sliver of hope in his heart. He thought that this unknown enemy should not recognize him. As long as he did not make a sound and did not reveal his identity, there was a chance that the other soldiers would mix together and find an opportunity to retaliate. Nanlidi, who always had his own thoughts, quickly found that his hopes were dashed once again. This was all because he saw someone. A centurion under his command, a Heki, was holding a torch and identifying the captives. In a short period of time, a number of centurions had been identified. This scene caused Nanlidi to lower his head involuntarily. Unfortunately, a Heki quickly appeared in front of him and ordered him to raise his head. Nanlidi had no choice but to raise his head with a ferocious gaze. He wanted to warn a Heki not to spout nonsense, but just as he raised his head, a palm landed on his face. At this time, General Nantai still wants to threaten me? Needless to say, this slap was from a Heki. He was using the power of the 5-star army to vent his anger. If it was not for this person pushing him aside, he would not have led his troops to guard the perimeter, and would not have been captured by the 5-star army so quickly. Of course, he was also using this opportunity to express his loyalty to the 5-star army. After witnessing the strength of the 5-star army, he had already given up on resisting. In his eyes, the most important thing was to survive. Nanlidi, who was slapped, was furious. As a Mongolian warrior, he cared a lot about his face. As the saying goes, when you hit someone, don't hit their face. Now that his face had been slapped, he only wanted to fight to the death with a heki. However, he had only taken a step forward when he was met with a flurry of punches and kicks from the 2 5-star army soldiers standing beside a heki. After who knew how many kicks, Nanlidi finally became obedient. Lying on the ground, he felt that lying on the ground was a very comfortable thing. He is the commander of the troops, General Nanlidi. I will have to trouble the two of you to bring him over. Unlike facing Nanlidi, a heki had a flattering expression. Under the drag of the 2 5-star army soldiers, Nanlidi was thrown in front of Yang Chidong, who was already sitting under the golden blade. Just as he was about to lie on the ground and play dead, a clear voice entered his ears. If you don't want to die, kneel properly. Chapter 1377. With the scene of him killing the surrendered Mongol soldiers, Nanlidi immediately knelt down and did not even waste a breath of time. The soft feared the hard feared the rash, and the rash feared those who did not care about their lives. The facts proved that the ancients did not lie. The 2,000 Mongol cavalry were either killed or surrendered. After the matter was tallied, not a single one of them managed to escape. This was because Nanlidi was too careless and did not even send out a single scout. Maybe he thought that he was the king in this world and no one dared to offend him. None of the 2,000 Mongol cavalry managed to escape, and none of the Russian girls managed to escape. The tallied result was that there were close to 400 of them. Among them, there were many women who were close to 50 years old. From this, one could see that the Mongol cavalry were a bunch of country bumpkins who wanted anyone. Along with Yang Chindong's arrival, these Russian girls were naturally released and Nikolaev personally talked to them. Based on Yang Chindong's instructions, if they could find their own tribe, they would be given food and allowed to leave. They would also take the chance to spread the news of the 5-star army's arrival, and some policies that would benefit the people. On the other hand, if they had no home to return to, they could follow the 5-star army to All City, which was where the far eastern province was. When they reached there, whether they remarried or started their own tribe, as long as they were willing to work hard for the 5-star army, they would not starve to death. On the contrary, those who worked hard would change and live a better life. At this moment, Nikolaev was filled with absolute respect for Yang Chindong. He personally saw 1,500 5-star army soldiers deal with 2,000 Mongol cavalry like they were chopping vegetables. At this moment, he already had the thought of joining the 5-star army. He placed a lot of importance on the mission that Yang Chindong gave him and wanted to complete it well. They did not rest for the entire night, and Nikolai brought his 4 brothers to talk to almost all the Russian women. After confirming that more than 30 of them could find their own tribe, they gave them food and allowed them to leave. There were still around 350 Russian women left in the camp, and they would be sent along with the 2,000 Mongol cavalrymen who were captured and sent to the city of Arr. The only difference was that these women were considered good citizens while these Mongol captives had to do manual labor. In the future, they would have to repair the city walls and roads. The next morning, Yang Chindong first listened to Nicholas' report. After knowing that Nicholas had completed the task well, he gave him some encouragement. Then, he saw Nanlidi, who had become very obedient after being tortured for a night. Bagam of Gojoseon, this sinner is willing to take my place. Please don't kill me, don't kill me. A night of torture made Nanlidi understand what was worse than death. At this moment, he did not dare to think about what happened last night. He only wanted to live, even if he had to sacrifice his dignity. Very good. Then immediately follow your agreement, and report the appearance of the 5-star army's reinforcements at the Amurga River. Remember, no matter what method you use, as long as you can lure the main force of your cavalry over, it will be a great achievement. Otherwise, if you can't complete this task, you can prepare to die. No, it will be worse than death. Yang Chindong didn't look at Nanlidi. He didn't have a good impression of such a spineless general. If it wasn't for the fact that he still needed this person, he would have already ordered people to drag him out and behead him. Yang Chindong gave him a chance, and Nanlidi readily agreed. He knew that whether he lived or died, or lived a life worse than death, would depend on the completion of this task. How could he dare to be careless? After he left the tent, he took the initiative to look for a Heki. The 5-star army would not allow him to leave. Some things could only be done by someone trusted by the Khan. Yang Chidong did not care about what Nanliti was going to do. He brought the army and retreated towards the Amerga River. When he came, he had already observed that the terrain was very suitable for a large army to fight. He had to set up a trap in advance and wait for the enemy to take the bait. Arching, the place where the capital of the eastern state was located. At this moment, the largest mansion had already become the residence of Abelia Khan Hurahan. It had been more than 3 months since they occupied Arching. This was also the most comfortable winter that Hurahan had ever experienced. In the past, when he was in the Abelia region, when winter came, it would feel like a year. Everywhere was white snow. In some places where there was no wind, the snow was almost 10 feet deep. Even if the cavalry fell into the snow, they would quickly disappear without a trace. In such an environment, no work could be done. Everyone could only stay in their yurts to hide. This was also known as the winter cat. Even if Hurahan was the Khan, it was the same. The only difference was that the yurt he stayed in was bigger. However, this year's winter was completely different. In the far eastern state, although the snow was still falling and the weather was still cold, there were wide streets and hundreds of thousands of people of various races. There were also many goods and food that could not be found in the Abradia region. This place was like a big treasure trove. Hurahan and his soldiers were dazzled. Then came a round of looting. Whether it was food, goods, houses, money, or women, they all became the targets of their looting. In order to prevent the people in the city from escaping, Hurahan had also ordered the 4 cities to be sealed off. Without his permission, no one was allowed to leave this place. This made Dal City seem like a large sheep pen, where hundreds of thousands of people were kept as their prey. Hurahan, who had never been so rich, could finally eat his fill. He could wear clean and warm cotton-padded clothes. Every night, when he slept, a different woman would warm his bed. Those days were so beautiful that he would not want to change them even if he was given a fairy's body. After 3 months of such drunken stupor, Hurahan had put on a lot of weight. Not only him, but the cavalry under his command had also become much stronger. After getting used to living a good life, he was afraid that he would go back and live a poor life. So, he was troubled. Where was the food in the eastern state? This became a sore point for Hurahan. According to Tangxing, who had surrendered, there was a batch of relief food in the far eastern region. It was to prevent natural disasters from happening. There were about 1 million dawn of food. If it was only for the 30,000 cavalrymen, it could last them for 10 to 20 years. If they could find this food, wouldn't it mean that they would not have to worry about food for the next 20 years? When he heard this news, one could imagine how excited Hurahan was. But the only fly in the ointment was that other than Governor Chenbo, no one knew where the food was hidden. Hurahan did not believe it and ordered his general, Akma, to lead his men to search all over the city. Some places were even dug up, but they did not find anything. Seeing that the food in the city was getting lesser and lesser, and if this went on, they would have to rob the people of their food. Hurahan began to panic and had no choice but to increase the search for Chenbo. But Chenbo seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Not only that, but the other 3 division commanders of the Far Eastern Army had also disappeared. Hurahan did not believe that Chenbo would leave just like that. According to Tangxing, he had injured the governor back then, so he would not be able to escape far with his injuries. Moreover, the eastern state was the result of years of hard work by the governor. He would not give up so easily. Find him. If he is alive, I want to see his corpse. Hurahan called General Akma, the surrendered general, Tangxing, and the Russian merchant Belinsky, who had provided him with important information. In front of them, he slammed his fist on the table and said sternly, "General Tang, has there been any news from the other spies you arranged in the Far Eastern Army?" The furious Hurahan first looked at Tangxing and asked. "No." Tangxing shook his head. He didn't understand why none of the spies in the army had sent him any news. Could it be that they had been found? That was impossible. How long had it been? Tang Xing was puzzled. But Supreme General Akmu didn't care that much. Seeing that the Great Khan was angry and that he wanted to see the corpse, he naturally agreed. He also said that he would immediately send out more scouts and expand the search area to find the remnants of the Far Eastern province. As a surrendered general, Tang Xing, who had nowhere else to go, also said that he would fully cooperate with General Akmu and search for Chenbo's possible hiding places to prevent any loopholes. Both of the generals had expressed their stance, which made Houlihan reveal a satisfied expression. Then, his gaze fell on the merchant, Belinsky, wanting to see what he had to say. The real reason why Houlihan was able to conquer the Far Eastern state was because of this Belinsky. Belinsky grew up in a white family. Because of his parents' low status, he had never eaten a proper meal before he grew up. At that time, he had vowed that he would change everything through his own efforts. In the future, his children would not have to worry about food anymore. It was said that the children of the poor were able to take charge of the family at an early age. After Belinsky had his ambition, he worked hard for it. Coupled with his talent, he slowly became a true merchant. In order to obtain more benefits, he traveled extensively and was not afraid of danger. One time, he accidentally came to the Far Eastern prefecture and saw a huge city standing there. At that time, regardless of whether it was Siberia or the Far Eastern region, they were all undeveloped and deserted. Other than the few cities where the Khans were located, one could occasionally see a tribe of 1,000 people. Those could be considered prosperous. However, there were hundreds of thousands of people from various races in Dal City. This shocked Belinsky and made him very excited. Merchants knew that as long as there were people, they could do business. These hundreds of thousands of people were equivalent to hundreds of thousands of customers, which meant that they could earn an uncountable amount of money. Chapter 1378. In his excitement, Belinsky used his business methods to understand the situation in the city, as well as the prices of the various items in the city. As his understanding of the city deepened, he was also deeply shocked by the dazzling array of goods in the city. For example, glass products, perfume, silk, tea leaves, and so on were all used here. Once these things were sold elsewhere, the benefits would be unimaginable. In his excitement, Belinsky took out all of his savings to purchase goods in all city. Gradually, he established a relationship with Tang Xing. Under his intentional roping, the two of them quickly became friends, and he was also able to learn some secrets that no one else knew. For example, if a Han merchant were to purchase goods from Arching, the costs would be reduced by a lot, and they would receive a lot of preferential treatment. For example, Tang Xing actually had Mongolian blood in him, and his tribe was in the Abelia region, etc. Belinsky had always been an ambitious businessman. After learning about the situation, he had other ideas. For example, he could drive the Han people out of the Far Eastern region and let him personally control everything. That way, his strength would increase by hundreds or even thousands of times in the shortest amount of time. At that time, he would no longer need to run around doing business. At that time, his descendants would no longer have to worry about not having enough to eat. After the ambitious Belinsky left the Far Eastern region, he came to the Siberia region to look for Khan Hurahan. If he wanted to achieve his goal, he needed a powerful partner, and Hurahan was that person in his heart. Hurahan, who was also ambitious, quickly got together with Belinsky. Then, they took control of Tang Xing's tribe and used him as a spy to launch a surprise attack. Without any preparation, Chenbo was injured and fled, and the Far Eastern region changed hands. In fact, Hurahan was able to live a good life now because of the information and help provided by Belinsky. Therefore, in his heart, he still valued this merchant very much. Now, he looked at him and wanted to hear if he had any good opinions. This did not disappoint Houlihan. From the perspective of a merchant, Belinsky made a suggestion: open the city gates and let the commoners out. At the same time, offer a large reward for information on Chenbo's whereabouts. No matter who it was, what tribe they were from, or what status they had in the past, as long as they could provide information on Chenbo's whereabouts, they would be rewarded with 50,000 taels of silver. If you can capture him alive and deliver him to me, you will be rewarded with 100,000 taels of silver. Whether it was 50,000 or 100,000, it was not a small number. If they hadn't conquered Arching, even if they sold Hirahin, they wouldn't have been able to gather so much money. But now, he had already occupied the far eastern state. He had plundered a lot of good things here, but he didn't have time to take away the silver. These mere tens of thousands of silver taels were nothing in his eyes. Great Khan, everyone has a greedy heart. As long as we offer a large enough reward, no one will not be tempted. Once the news spreads, we don't have to worry about Chenbo not showing up, Belinsky said confidently. This came from his understanding of human nature. In this world, no one didn't like money. All they had to do was provide information and they could get 50,000 taels of silver. They wouldn't be able to finish eating and drinking for the rest of their lives. Who wouldn't be tempted? The so-called loyalty was only because the bargaining chip for betrayal wasn't enough. Now that Belinsky had raised this bargaining chip and was satisfied, anyone with a weak will would know what decision to make. Good, very good. Hu Lihan was overjoyed when he heard that. He just wanted to find Chenbo and use him to find the 1,000,000 dan of grain. He didn't care about the process. A huge net was set up to find Chenbo. At this time, Chenbo didn't know that someone had put a bounty on his head. He didn't even know that Yang Chendong had led the army into the Far East. At this time, he was suffering from a fever in a forest 50 miles east of Arching, enduring a life-and-death crisis. It's still not working. He's still burning, the captain of the guards, Xia Qian, said worriedly after removing his hand from Chenbo's forehead. If it doesn't work, then boil some water. The commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, Kong He, clenched and unclenched his right fist. He seemed to have made a decision. Tang Xing's sudden attack had caught Chenbo off guard. He had been stabbed while running away. Fortunately, the Far Eastern Army had a complete set of traditional Chinese medicine, so a knife wound wasn't fatal. However, Chenbo hadn't had a good rest. His wound had become infected while he was running, causing him to have a high fever. Although the wound was no longer inflamed, if the fever didn't subside, his life would still be in danger. Scalding one's feet with hot water was a good way to get rid of the fever. Everyone who studied under Yang Shui knew this. However, the problem was that they were in a state of hibernation. They couldn't boil water and smoke to attract attention. If Chenbo woke up, he would never allow such a thing to happen. However, this was a matter of life and death. When Chenbo wasn't awake, Commander Kong He took his position and gave this order. Okay, let's be careful. The captain of the guards, Xia Qian, nodded and ordered someone to make the arrangements. He himself didn't leave Chenbo's side at all times. He even had a short knife with him. Following Tang Xing's rebellion, it was hard for Xia Qian to trust anyone. Speaking of which, it was precisely because of Tang Xing's rebellion that Chenbo became vigilant. He firmly grasped the military power in his hands and gave the order when he was running away. Without his military order and tiger tally, even the 3 commanders couldn't mobilize the soldiers of the Far Eastern Army. As a result, the counterattack couldn't be carried out and the 3 divisions could only find a place to hide. If he wanted to turn the situation around, the first thing he had to do was to wake Chenbo up. In order to achieve this goal, Xia Qian didn't care whether he would be discovered or not. Since no matter what he did, it would be contradictory. He would just choose the lesser of 2 evils. They naturally didn't lack firewood in the mountains. The only problem was that once they did this, smoke would inevitably be produced. This was a dangerous thing that could easily expose their location. As a result, even though the guards were extremely careful, there was still smoke coming out of the forest. It was spotted by the Mongolian scouts who were searching nearby. However, due to the distance, he couldn't immediately go forward to investigate. After thinking for a moment, he turned his horse around and rushed towards a nearby Mongolian army. Just as this Mongolian scout was about to leave, there was another cavalry scout about 8 li away who also saw this scene and left. The hot water was finally boiled. The unconscious Chenbo was supported by Xia Qian as he placed his feet into the tub of hot water. With a cry, Chenbo woke up from the hot water and slowly fainted again. Fortunately, after soaking in the hot water, his body began to sweat. After 2 hours, his body temperature began to drop and Chenbo woke up again. With the fever temporarily gone, Chenbo's spirit seemed to be much better. With Xia Qian's support, he forced himself to sit up. He first looked at the tub that was still warm and frowned. "You guys started a fire?" "Yes, it was my order." The 2nd Cavalry Division's commander, Kong He, took a step forward and took responsibility. Beside him, Commander Xia Qian also followed up and said, "I also agree." AI. Hearing that they had started a fire, Chenbo sighed. At this moment, he didn't know what to say. However, since the fire had already started, it was too late to say anything. He could only hope that no one would discover them. "All right, let's not talk about this matter. This place could be exposed at any moment. We need to leave this place immediately and look for another safe place. Commander, the 2nd Cavalry Division is nearby. Should we gather with them?" Knowing that the commander would make such an arrangement, Division Commander Kong He volunteered. "No." Chenbo shook his head and said decisively, "We are in danger at any moment. Tang Xing has rebelled. No one knows if there are any spies in the army. For the safety of the army, we cannot take the initiative to contact anyone. A person couldn't fall in the same place twice." Chenbo's method was understandable. Although it was a little passive, it was better in terms of safety. After the other 3 divisions went into martial law, it could indeed ensure their safety to the greatest extent. However, this way, the military would be in danger. "It's fine. With our guard division, we will protect the general's safety even if we have to risk our lives." As the commander, Xia Qian had a determined expression. Although the guard division had suffered heavy losses on the way out of Alair City, there were less than 200 people left from the original 2,000 people. However, even if there was only one person left, they had to arrange for the general to be sent out. "Good." Hearing Xia Qian's attitude, Chenbo patted the back of his hand in satisfaction. Then, his face was covered by a layer of worry. "Sigh, it's a pity that our radio is broken and we can't contact the outside world. The situation here can't be spread out in time. I think the 6th young master must be worried sick." Chenbo temporarily regained consciousness. However, it didn't eliminate the possibility of him having a high fever at any moment. After all, the hot water treatment didn't solve the problem. Without a safe environment to rest, the fever could reappear at any moment. Using this time, the guard division made the decision to move. However, just as everyone was packing up and Chenbo was being carried onto a military stretcher, a soldier hurriedly came to report that there was a large group of Mongolian cavalry outside the mountain. There were at least 1,000 of them. "They found us so quickly?" Whether it was Kong He or Xia Qian, their faces sank. Chapter 1379. Maybe this is fate. How about this, you guys go first, and I'll cover you. Remember, no one can have the right to mobilize the army without an order. If I die, then wait for the 6th young master to send a new commander to give the order." In comparison, Chenbo's expression was calmer, as if everything that happened was not out of his expectations. "No, if we're leaving, we'll leave together." Xia Qian and Kong He said almost at the same time. As the captain of the guards, protecting Chenbo was his most important task. Once the commander was in trouble, he would naturally not be able to avoid punishment. It was understandable that he would say such words. However, Kong He was the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, so he did not need to do this. However, Kong He still made such a decision. When Chenbo heard it, he could not help but sigh. He could understand Kong He. He was originally the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, but because he was worried about his illness, he took the initiative to leave the division. Now, it was not impossible for him to return to the division, but after he returned, he would probably only be able to hide in the dark and would not be able to mobilize the army. After Tang Xing's rebellion, without Qinbo's orders, even the commander could not mobilize the army. He felt that this commander had no authority. Instead of going back to hide, he might as well kill the enemy here and leave his life or death to the heavens. In fact, Qinbo used to trust Commander Kong He very much. Otherwise, he would not have arranged for him to guard the nest in the far eastern region when he sent troops to rescue Beginning City. However, since there was a problem with Tang Xing, as the commander, he had given the order that the army should not move without orders, so he had to treat everyone equally. Sighing, Qinbo knew that it was impossible to chase the two of them away. He could only speak while he was still conscious. Since that's the case, let's move to a safe place now. Let's go. After Xia Qian agreed, he ordered the guards to speed up. At the same time, he sent out scouts to scout the enemy's situation. He wanted to find an opening where the enemy was weak to charge out. There were 1,000 Mongolian cavalrymen surrounding this area. They were quite lucky and were patrolling this area. When they heard the report from the scouts, they rushed over with the intention of giving it a try. Unexpectedly, they really bumped into a big fish. Although he wasn't sure if the person who was surrounded was a general from the far eastern region, it was already a great achievement that he was able to fight back. The Mongolian general's eyes glowed with excitement as he said, "Don't be in a rush to attack. We need to surround them before we attack. In any case, we cannot let a single person escape." It had to be said that these Mongol cavalry were quite strong. After roaming the Siberian region for many years, they had unique experience in fighting cavalry in mountainous regions. In this aspect, even the 5-star army that had been through hundreds of battles would not be their match. This was also the main reason why Yang Qindong did not immediately head for Arching, but instead set up an ambush beside the Amuga River. It was because they were good at fighting in the mountains that the 1,000 Mongolian cavalrymen did not take the Far Eastern Army seriously. In their eyes, the Far Eastern Army was just a defeated opponent. Therefore, after the order was given, they did not rush to surround the Far Eastern Army. This made Xia Qian and the others, who were in the middle of the encirclement, very anxious. They were already prepared to fight back with all their might when the enemy charged at them. They were also prepared to look for a weak point to break out of the encirclement. However, the enemy did not panic and continued to shrink the encirclement. In this way, it would be hard to say if there was a weak point. They are still not in a rush to charge. We have to make the first move. Xia Qian was not a stubborn person. Otherwise, he would not have become the captain of the guards. After thinking deeply, he made a decision. He wanted to counterattack first, and see if he could disrupt the enemy's formation and find a way to break out of the encirclement. Let me go. You have to stay behind and ensure the safety of the general. This is the most important thing. Kong He stood up again and made his decision to lead the troops. No. This is my responsibility as the captain of the guards. How can I let Mr. Kong take the risk? Xia Qian shook his head and said, What do you mean by taking the risk? Do you think we will be safe if we stay here? Kong He did not back down. Obviously, the two of them saw the danger in front of them. Instead of sitting here and waiting for death, they might as well charge out and fight the enemy to their heart's content. At least they could kill a few enemies. The two of them were still arguing. Neither of them had the intention to back down. On the outside, the Mongolian cavalrymen were getting closer and closer to them. The encirclement was also shrinking. It looked like the battle would start at any moment. However, they did not know that behind them, there was a group of cavalrymen quickly gathering and closing in on them. They were the vanguard that Yang Qindong sent out. They were the vanguard led by Dai Qua, the former commander of the Far Eastern Army's 1st Cavalry Division. Considering that Dai Qua was familiar with the situation here, Yang Qindong sent him out to see if he could find Qinbo's position. When the time was right, he would coordinate with him from the inside. Based on his understanding of the military commander, Dai Qua searched a few places but did not find anything. When he once again marked out a region and wanted to continue searching, a scout reported that he saw smoke floating out from the mountains. He immediately brought a group of cavalrymen and rushed over. Considering that the information had not been confirmed and he was not sure if this was the location of the Far Eastern Army, Daiqu did not increase his speed. He was very careful to avoid being discovered by the Mongolian scouts. It was only when the scout at the front reported that they found many Mongolian cavalrymen outside the mountain and that they were moving forward that Daiqu disregarded everything and rushed over. Since the Mongolian cavalrymen were moving, there must be a target here. Wouldn't their target be the Far Eastern Army that he was looking for? Thinking that he was finally going to find the missing army, Daiqu was a little excited. He could not help but increase the speed of his army. One side was moving at full speed, while the other side was slowly encircling. With one increasing and one decreasing, the distance between the two sides was quickly closing. A huge battle was brewing in the forest. Reporting, a large number of unknown cavalrymen have appeared behind us. The Mongolian scouts were not incompetent. Daiqua's actions behind them finally attracted their attention. At this moment, the distance between the two sides was less than 10 li 20 li of open land and 10 li of forest. This was the distance that the scouts usually patrolled. When the Mongolian general Ulu heard the news, he was not worried but happy. Didn't this prove that they had caught a big fish? Otherwise, why would so many enemy cavalrymen appear? Can you see how many people there are? Ulu's voice carried a trace of excitement and agitation as he asked. There are too many trees, so I can't be sure. However, there should be no less than 1,000 people. The scout first shook his head and then thought carefully before explaining. Okay. Hearing that there were no less than 1,000 people, Ulu was even more delighted. If there were too many enemies, he might have to consider whether or not he had the strength to fight. However, if they were on the same level as him, he had nothing to worry about. With the same number of soldiers, his cavalrymen were better at fighting in the mountains. He was confident that he could deal a heavy blow to the enemy. Send down the order. Apart from leaving 200 men to keep an eye on the target in the mountains, everyone else get ready to charge. Ulu decided to take down this group of enemy cavalrymen. In order to obtain the merit, he did not have the intention to report it to his superiors. This caused him to lose the last chance to kill Chenbo. After the 1,000 Mongolian cavalrymen received the order, they continued to advance slowly on the surface, shrinking the encirclement. However, they were secretly prepared to turn around and fight at any moment. Daiqua, who was quickly approaching from behind, did not notice this. He did not care who was surrounded. Based on the principle that an enemy of an enemy was a friend, he had to save them. As for whether or not he could defeat them, he was still confident. He was once a member of the Far Eastern Army, so Daiqua naturally knew about the strength of some Mongolian cavalrymen. Because the enemy had lived here since young, they were used to fighting in the mountains. If it was a one-on-one, he did not have much confidence. However, the scouts had reported that the enemy only had 1,000 cavalrymen. In terms of numbers, he had twice the enemy's. Furthermore, he had led the army through the baptism of war. Many of the soldiers were not veterans, but they had been through life and death situations. With double the number advantage, he was confident that he could defeat the enemy. Both sides had their own plans, and the distance between them was getting closer and closer. 10 miles, 8 miles, 6 miles. When they were only 3 miles away, they could hear the sound of horse hooves in the forest. The 800 Mongolian cavalrymen who were already prepared started to counterattack. They suddenly turned their horses around. As they ran back, they took out their bows. Charge! Kill them all! Daiqua took the lead and rushed to the front. When he vaguely saw the shadows of many enemies flashing from behind some trees, he didn't hold back and shouted loudly. When enemies meet on a narrow path, the brave will win. In the dense forest, the speed of the warhorse was not much of an advantage. Whoever was braver and more courageous would naturally have the advantage. There was no need for anyone to give any orders. When the distance between the two sides was less than an arrow's distance, many bows and arrows were shot from all directions towards the approaching 5-star army's cavalry. Ding ding dang dang, the sound of arrows clashing with cavalry swords could be heard. The 5-star army soldiers did not show any signs of fear and continued to charge forward. Even though along the way, some of their soldiers were shot off their horses, and some even died from the arrows, this did not stop them from advancing. The five-star army's rules were very strict. When the general gave the order, even if there was a mountain of blades and a sea of flames in front of them, as long as there was no order to stop, they were not allowed to take a step back. Chapter 1380. Under the strict military rules, the 2,000 cavalry did not retreat at all. They could only continue to advance, closing the distance between the two sides. At the same time, the archers started to reflect the arrows. In terms of archery, the five-star army had put in a lot of effort into training. Even though most of the Mongolian cavaliers had used the geographical advantage to hide behind some trees, the retaliation from the five-star army's archers still brought quite a lot of pressure to them. Even though their damage was not as great as when they were on the plains, they still managed to suppress the enemy's archers. After the five-star army paid the price of 200 cavalry casualties, they managed to close the distance between the two sides, and their advantage in numbers showed. This also forced the Mongol army, which only had 800 cavalry, to retreat. Yu, who was leading 200 cavalry to wait for news of the army's victory, suddenly heard that the battle was not going well and that the army was being forced to retreat. A look of panic flashed across his eyes. It was not as if he had never seen the strength of the Far East Army before. Tang Xing, the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Division, was not the only one who had surrendered. He had led an entire division of more than 8,000 men. As one of the Mongol generals, Yu had seen the training of the Far Eastern Army. It was really normal, and compared to them, they were more than 10% weaker. Logically speaking, such an army should not be hard to defeat. As long as the arrows successfully suppressed the enemy until they couldn't even raise their heads, then they could find a suitable moment to suddenly attack. With the momentum of a tiger leaping down the mountain, it was possible to destroy the enemy's formation. At the same time, the enemy's fighting spirit and morale would also be destroyed. Once the morale of the army was messed up, no general would be able to turn the tables. As such, before this battle, Yu was really confident. However, who would have thought that the enemy would be so strong? In just a short time, they had actually charged over and forced his army to retreat. Yu's face was filled with confusion, wondering how the strength of the Far Eastern Army had suddenly increased by so much. Suddenly, another wave of battle cries entered his ears. When he looked over in panic, he saw hundreds of Far Eastern armies suddenly attacking. Without enough preparation, his remaining 200 cavalry were actually suppressed. The ones attacking were the 200 guards who stayed by Chenbo's side. They had also heard the battle cries from the mountains. Based on their intuition, they knew that the reinforcements had arrived. Logically speaking, without Chenbo's tiger tally, the various divisions could not act rashly. However, since the reinforcements had arrived, they naturally had to do something. After some discussion, Kong He and Xia Qian each led 100 warriors and rushed down the mountain from 2 different directions. They used practical actions to support the reinforcements, to create a center. Facing enemies from 2 sides, even though Yu was filled with reluctance, he still decisively gave the order to retreat. He had already thought it through. Since he did not have the appetite to swallow up the Far Eastern Army, he would ask for reinforcements. After all, he was the one who discovered these enemies, so he would definitely get the credit. What he needed to do next was to keep an eye on these targets. The Mongolian cavalry suddenly retreated. However, whether it was Dai Qua, Kong He, or Xia Qian, none of them had any intention of chasing. They tried to get closer, wanting to see the other party's identity. Arching. Before Yu's battle report reached here, Aaheki appeared first. With the token from General Nanlidi, Aaheki successfully met General Akma. Following which, he followed Yang Qingdong's instructions and told him about the 5-star army that had come to help the Far Eastern Army. Hearing that the Far Eastern Army's reinforcements had appeared, Akma did not dare to delay and quickly brought Aaheki to meet Kagan Hulihan. Within the Kagan's tent, Hulihan called Belinsky and Tang Xing over to listen to the report. Along the way, Aaheki had already memorized Yang Chendong's instructions countless times. After seeing Hulahan, apart from the initial panic, he was able to think clearly and tell him everything. Based on Aaheki's description, the 5-star army only had 10,000 reinforcements, but the amount of supplies they brought was endless. There was no end to the carriages. While saying this, Aaheki noticed that both Hulahan and Akma's eyes were filled with desire. Obviously, they were stimulated by the spoils of war. On the other hand, Belinsky seemed to be in deep thought, but it was hard to tell what he was thinking about. There really are countless carriages? Hulahan did not think too deeply about it. He just wanted to confirm whether Aaheki's words were true or not. Yes, I dare to use my head as a guarantee, Aaheki said confidently. Ha, good, good. Hulahan laughed loudly, then his gaze fell on Tang Xing and asked, General Tang, you know the most about the 5-star army. Tell me about it. Yes. Tang Xing cupped his fists and replied, About the 5-star army, this subordinate has come into contact with them once. He had seen them on the grassland when he and Commander Chenbo were rescuing the beginning city. To be honest, they are very powerful and have a lot of troops. If we were to fight them on the grasslands, I'm afraid we wouldn't be their match. Oh, they're that powerful? Hulahan felt uncomfortable all over when he heard this. After all, the strength of the enemy always made him feel uneasy. Yes, they are very powerful. When the 5-star army launched their attack, the hundreds of thousands of cavalrymen of the Walu tribe and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers of the great Ming dynasty were no match for them. Tang Xing recalled the scene that had happened in front of him, and sighed. He even thought about whether his betrayal of the 5-star army was a good thing or a bad thing. However, it was already done, and it was meaningless to dwell on it now. He threw the pressure brought by the 5-star army to the back of his mind and continued, But that's only in an open area, like in a mountain forest. I think they can't even use 30% of their usual strength. In addition, the Far East is vast, with many mountains and lakes, and the roads are difficult to travel. It's not convenient for the army to move, and the transportation of food is also extremely difficult. In comparison, there's nothing to be afraid of. Hulahan was initially shocked by the might of the 5-star army, but when he heard Tang Xing's words, he couldn't help but nod his head and say, That's right, this is the Far East, not the grasslands. No matter how strong the 5-star army is, they won't be able to send their army here. Otherwise, just the rations alone will cause them to fall into chaos. In the end, this is our territory. Since they want to extend their tentacles here, we might as well cut them off and let them know who has the final say here. Hulahan, who already had a plan, changed his tone after saying this. He looked at Akma and said, Great General, this Khan will give you 10,000 elite troops. Do you have the confidence to defeat the 5-star army and bring back all the supplies they brought? As the great general of the Mongolian army, Akma was definitely a fierce general. It could be said that he wasn't afraid of anything. When Tang Xing said that the 5-star army was so powerful, he snorted disdainfully. He wanted to prove that he was the strongest when he had the chance. Now that he had been chosen, there was no reason for him to disagree. He immediately said loudly, Don't worry, Great Khan, 10,000 elite troops will be enough to take care of this 5-star army reinforcements. Haha, as expected of a great general. Good, if that's the case, then this Khan will wait to hear your good news. Hulahan laughed loudly. Clearly, he was in a good mood. Yes. A proud expression flashed across Akma's face as he turned and left. Belinsky and Tang Xing then left as well. After walking out of Hurahan's residence, Belinsky suddenly stopped in his tracks and looked at Tang Xing, asking, General Tang, the 5-star army only has about 10,000 cavalrymen. Why do we need to bring so many supplies when we're out? Oh. Tang Xing chuckled and said, The 5-star army doesn't lack money at all. Although they have been fighting in the north and south for the past few years, I have never heard of a shortage of resources. Every time they go to war, they will bring enough supplies and supplies. This has already become a habit. I see. After hearing this, Belinsky couldn't help but reveal a look of shock. Earlier, he was wondering if this was a trap set by the 5-star army. Now, it seemed that he was thinking too much. However, when he thought about how rich the 5-star army's resources were, he couldn't help but yearn for it. Unfortunately, he had already joined forces with Houlihan and offended the 5-star army. It would be difficult for him to cooperate with them in the future. Not long after Belinsky and Tang Xing left the residence, another scout came to see them. They were sent by General Ulu to ask for reinforcements. When Houlihan heard that he had found traces of the Far Eastern Army, he was naturally overjoyed. However, he didn't immediately send troops to eliminate them. In his opinion, the Far Eastern Army was already a dish in his bowl that could be picked up at any time. Instead, the 5-star army was the target that needed to be dealt with immediately. He was afraid that if he was late, the 5-star army would run away. Go back and tell General Ulu that this Khan will send 1,000 cavalry to help. Have them keep an eye on the Far Eastern Army. When General Akmu returns in triumph, it will be time to send troops to deal with the Far Eastern Army. Houlihan made the decision to deal with the 5-star army first before dealing with the Far Eastern Army. What he didn't expect was that this move would give the Far Eastern Army, which was already on the verge of death, time to breathe. This would sow the seeds of his defeat. General Dai Qua led the army to meet up with Division Commander Kong He in the mountains. Then, he went to see Commander Chenbo, who had fainted once again. After the temperature dropped again, Commander Chenbo slowly woke up. When he opened his eyes and saw Dai Qua, his originally dispirited aura also became excited. Division Commander Dai, why are you here? Did the reinforcements arrive? Chapter 1381. Yes, General. The 6th young master has arrived personally. He's bringing close to 100,000 soldiers and logistical personnel towards Al City. Dai Qua held Chenbo's hand tightly as he spoke in an equally excited manner. What? The 6th young master has arrived personally? Haha, that's great. Cough, cough, cough. Chenbo coughed violently because he was too excited. Sir, please take care of your body, Dai Qua said with concern when he saw Chenbo's face turning red. It's fine, it's fine. The 6th young master is here. I'll get better soon. Ha! Chenbo laughed again after he panted for a while. Although his fever had not completely subsided, it was obvious that he was in a better mood. Dai Qua was relieved when he saw that Chenbo seemed to be in a good mood. Without this person, he would not be a commander. He was grateful to his savior, so he asked for instructions when he spoke. Sir, I brought a radio this time. Do you have anything to say to the 6th young master? Radio? That's great. Report the Far Eastern Army's situation to the 6th young master immediately and ask for further instructions. Chenbo's expression became more excited. He looked like he wanted to receive Yang Chendong's reply right away. The radio was taken out, and the report was sent out immediately after it was connected. Chenbo narrated in detail about the fall of Arching and Chenbo's suspicions about some of the officers in the army. Before his suspicions were resolved, he did not dare to gamble with the army. Therefore, he did not move the army without permission and reported the situation one by one. When the radio was sent out, Yang Chendong, who was far away at the Amuga River, had already dug a pocket. He was just waiting for the Mongolian cavalry to enter. At that moment, Commander Dai Qua's telegram was sent to him. Yang Chendong calmly read the contents of the telegram. He wasn't angry, nor was he angry. As a lone army, the Far Eastern Army had been subjected to all kinds of tests ever since it was established. Due to geographical reasons, they couldn't get the support of the 5-star Army headquarters. This caused problems to arise during the construction process. The process of taking a new path had always been tortuous. Yang Chendong had long anticipated that there would be various problems. It was just that he had suffered a huge loss this time. Even the city was lost, which was far beyond his expectations. Fortunately, according to the telegram, the other supplies from the first city and Shichian city were stored in another safe place and were not lost. This could be considered a blessing in disguise. As for what Chenbo said about the problems in the army, Yang Chendong could understand. After all, Other than the initial part of the Far Eastern Army soldiers, the rest were recruited from the local area. Such an army would not have any problems if nothing happened. However, once they encountered adversity, it was hard to say. However, no matter what, Chenbo's method of dealing with it was still good. He completely hid the army and controlled them. He did not allow any of them to go out. This could ensure that the army would not fall into chaos. Of course, this was not a good plan. At least, it was not a long-term plan. Fortunately, Yang Chendong was here. All of this would not be a problem anymore. Come, send a telegram to Chenbo. Tell him that he can release the army. Tell him not to worry about the problems in the army. If there are problems, solve them. If the pustules don't show up, there are always hidden dangers. Now, it's time to dig out these tumors. With his hands behind his back, Yang Chendong's aura surged, giving people a feeling of omnipotence. This time, since he came to the Far Eastern region, he naturally had to solve the problem. It would be fine if those disloyal people were honest. However, if they dared to do anything extreme, he did not mind using some heads as a sacrifice. Facing the foreign races, Yang Chendong would never be polite when he raised his butcher's knife. The telegram was quickly sent back. Yang Chendong also returned his thoughts to the present. Just now, the scouts had reported that the 10,000 Mongolian cavalry reinforcements had already left Archon and were heading towards the Amuga River. They didn't even bring any rations with them. It was obvious that they were here with the intention of plundering. They would appear in front of him in 3 days. Come to die! Yang Chendong walked out of the tent and looked in the direction of Arching. He saw countless 5-star army soldiers digging horse traps. His eyes were filled with anticipation. Akmu personally led the 10,000 Mongolian cavalry and rushed day and night. In less than 3 days, they were 30 miles away from the Amuga River. The scouts had already been sent out, and there would be news soon. While arranging for the army to rest, Akmu also waited for the news from the scouts. He had already prayed to Tengri more than once that the 5-star army would not escape. Perhaps the prayers were effective, as the scouts returned and reported that the 5-star army was just 20 miles away from them. That's right. When he heard that the enemy was not 30 miles away but 20 miles away, Akmu heaved a sigh of relief. This was enough to prove that the 5-star army had been rushing and not waiting at the same spot. If the 5-star army's position did not change a few days ago, he would have thought that the enemy already knew that he was coming and had prepared a trap for him. But now, the enemy had left their original position. This was enough to prove that his suspicions were unnecessary. In the past few days, the 5-star army had only rushed a few dozen miles. Not only did this not make Akmu think too much, it even made him look down on them. Just from the speed of the other party's movement, they were not a strong army at all. Naturally, his confidence in this battle had risen a little. Pass down the order. The army should have a good rest. We will attack the camp tonight. Oh right, let the people guarding a Heki relax and prepare some good food for him, Akmu said with a relaxed expression. He had some suspicions about a Heki before, so he arranged for people to watch him. Now that he did not have so many suspicions, he did not need to watch him too closely. Who knows, he might be a meritorious official. As the general that the Khan of Siberia relied on the most, Akmu was very proud and also very careful. He did not even send people to contact General Lulu. He decided to send a message after the attack tonight. This way, he could guarantee that he would take all the credit and not leak any information before the attack. It had to be said that this kind of consideration was very careful. But this time, the opponent was Yang Chendong. He was a war god who had carried out countless dangerous missions in both his previous life and this life. If they had to be compared, then one was the bright moon in the sky and the other was the light of a firefly. There was no comparison at all. Even though Akmu used all his methods, none of his actions could escape from Yang Chendong's grasp. When he learned from his scouts that the Mongolian cavaliers had entered a resting state, while he was 20 miles away, he predicted that they might come to ambush the camp that night. After calling Tian Hu, Beta Persei and the others, Yang Chendong gave the order to meet the enemy tonight. The two people who admired Yang Chendong very much did not hesitate to turn around and make the arrangements. According to the agreement, once the Mongolian army made a move, Ba Daojiang, who followed Ulu, should send a message. But now, there was no news, so it was a bit hasty to prepare to meet the enemy. But the order was given by Yang Chendong, so no one doubted it. Time quickly passed from noon to afternoon, and then the sky slowly darkened. The scouts sent a message through the radio. The Mongolian cavalry had indeed begun to move. They had moved. After receiving this news, Beta Persei was not surprised at all. Since the young master said that they would come at night, then they would definitely come. Send a message to Ba Daojiang. Once the battle starts, tell them to surround Akma from the back and try to kill as many enemies as possible. Yang Chendong said confidently with his hands behind his back. This time, he was not greedy to the point that he would not let even one enemy escape. After all, it was 10,000 cavalry, and he only had a little more than 10,000 troops. It would not be a problem to heavily injure the enemy, but it would be too difficult to kill them all. In other words, after this battle, the 5-star army's strength would be known to the Siberian Mongolian cavalry. As long as the enemy did not have a pig's brain, they would definitely think of a way to leave this place. Taking advantage of this opportunity, they would kill as many enemies as they could. The 5-star army had already made their preparations. They had dug a big hole and were only waiting for the enemy to walk into it. Akmu, who did not know this, was indeed walking step by step towards the abyss. After the sky darkened, Akmu, as the general, gave the order to attack. 10,000 Mongol cavalrymen got on their horses and charged over in a grand manner, causing the birds in the forest to fly into the air in a panic. They seemed to have sensed the powerful killing intent as well. It was only a distance of 20 miles, and the Mongolian vanguard who had already planned out the best route took less than an hour to reach the area 2 miles away from the 5-star army's camp. At this moment, the 5-star army's camp was in a state of panic. It gave people the feeling that they did not expect anyone to attack them at this moment. They were completely unprepared. Get into formation. When Akmu arrived with the main force of the Mongolian cavalry, he also saw this scene. Immediately, his face was filled with joy. The chaos in the enemy camp made him look like a cat playing with a mouse. In order for the cavalry to unleash their full potential, they had to display their ferocious offensive abilities during the charge. Only by doing so would they be able to severely injure their opponents at the first moment, and gain the initiative on the battlefield. This also required them to spread out in a formation that was dense enough and not obstructed each other at the same time to ensure that their combat strength could be better displayed. Chapter 1382. Charge! Akmu, who saw that the formation had spread out, could not wait to give the order to charge. When the Mongol soldiers heard the horn, they shouted and rode their horses over. As the distance got closer and closer, they readied their bows and waited, aiming at the 5-star army soldiers wearing military green uniforms one after another. Shio shio shio. Shio shio shio. When the distance between the two sides reached the range of the arrows seemed to have grown eyes and shot towards the soldiers of the 5-star army who were running back and forth in the camp without the need for any orders. In a short time, more than 100 5-star army soldiers were killed or injured by the arrows. Such a glorious result greatly boosted the morale of the Mongol cavalry. This was especially true for the cavalrymen at the very front. They had already disregarded the formation and charged forward as if they would not be able to kill the enemy and gain merit if they were a step too late. The hope of victory had already made them lose their sight. These Mongolian cavaliers did not notice that the so-called 5-star soldier they had killed actually looked very similar to them. In reality, these people were the Mongol captives that Yang Chendong had captured. Before the war, Yang Chendong had promised these people that if they were lucky enough to survive this war, they would be exempted from the death penalty. After that, they would only need to work in arching for 3 years before regaining their freedom. With the temptation of death in front of them, these surrendered soldiers had no choice but to fight. Almost 2,000 captives wanted to fight. However, the flames of war were merciless and swords and spears had no eyes. Soon, more than 200 people were killed or injured, and this number was constantly increasing, causing waves of cries for help. Akmu did not know about this. When he saw so many 5-star army soldiers die in front of him, he was completely blinded by victory. At that moment, he seemed to see countless treasures piled up in front of him for him to take. Not only Akmu, more and more Mongol cavalry were deeply stimulated by this temporary victory. They shouted and swung their swords. Sometimes, there would even be laughter after they hit their targets. It's about time. Under a big tree at the periphery of the battlefield, Yang Chinong saw that the enemy's front and middle troops had entered the pocket. His eyes finally showed a hint of killing intent. He looked at Beta Persei beside him and said, "Blow the horn of charge." Beep 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 beep, the loud horn suddenly sounded in the silent night. It was like a clap of thunder in the ears of the Mongol cavalry. After the bugle call sounded, the wooden planks around the camp of the 5-star army were suddenly removed, revealing wide and long horse traps. The sharp treetops in the pits were like ogres with their bloody mouths wide open, waiting for their prey to enter. The sudden sound of the horn and the pits around them scared the Mongol cavalry who had already charged into the 5-star army's camp. Their first thought they had fallen into a trap. They looked around like birds startled by the twang of a bow, and their eyes filled with fear. What's going on? As the commander of the army, Akmu was also trapped in the camp. After the sudden change in the situation, his face turned completely gloomy. His years of experience on the battlefield told him that things were bad. But in front of so many soldiers, he didn't want to admit this. So after shouting, he looked at a wooden box placed in the tent and shouted, "Men, pry open this box for this general." "Yes." 2 soldiers stepped forward after receiving the order. Then, a hole was opened in the wooden box under the great force. Then, a cry of surprise sounded. "This is an empty box." "What? Empty?" Akmu's face changed drastically. Then, he pointed at the other wooden boxes and some jars and shouted, "Open, open all of them!" In an instant, a group of soldiers rushed forward. But the result was not good. The wooden boxes were all empty. There was something in the jars, but it was not wine. It was kerosene. "Not good, it's kerosene. Be careful of a fire attack," Akmu cried out. As if to coordinate with him, countless torches suddenly appeared around the camp, illuminating the area as brightly as day. Countless cavalrymen were holding fire arrows, ready to fire. "Surrender, and you can live. Those who resist will die." The voice of persuasion sounded out again. Beta Persei's loud voice was used again. "Surrender? You must be dreaming." Looking around, he realized that all the soldiers behind him had already fled. Not only that, but the 5-star army around the tent had also fled at some point. Seeing that there was nothing to gain, Akmu shouted angrily, "We have more people. Don't be afraid of them. Listen to my orders and charge out." He knew that he had sinned heavily. Once he was captured by the 5-star army, he would not have a good ending. Thus, Akmu decided to take a risk. After the commanding general gave the order, the soldiers were also encouraged. They shouted loudly and were about to charge out on their horses. However, before they could charge forward, Yang Er had already given the order to shoot. Following that, tens of thousands of arrows were released in unison, bringing with them countless sparks as they rained down on the camp. The curtains of the tents were flammable to begin with, and with the help of the kerosene, very soon, a huge net of fire rose from the places where the fire arrows landed, and it wrapped around the Mongolian cavaliers one after another. When a person was faced with fire, perhaps a person with mental fortitude could remain calm. But war horses could not. When their pupils were filled with flames, they went berserk. No matter how their master ordered them, they no longer obeyed. Instead, they each rushed towards the safe zone they thought was the safest place. The war horses that charged out, no matter which direction they went, were all waiting for them in the wide horse traps. The sound of wooden stakes entering flesh could be heard, and the war horses that were still alive just a moment ago turned into dead horses one after another. The Mongolian cavaliers riding on their backs did not fare much better either. Most of the time, they were buried with the warhorses before they died. The fire was everywhere, and they could not stay there. There were also huge horse traps waiting for them outside. The Mongol cavalry were stuck in a dilemma. As the commander, Akim could not do anything. He could only watch as one soldier after another charged out and died in the pits. If they were surrounded by the fire, they would be burned to death. There were 8,000 Mongolian elite cavaliers, and other than the soldiers who were not part of the 5-star army, most of them died in this predicament where they could neither advance nor retreat. The fire burned for nearly an hour, causing the surroundings to be filled with the smell of roasted meat, which made people want to vomit. However, there were some who were lucky and did not die in the fire. After a full hour of torment, the fire around them gradually became smaller, and the surrounding horse traps were also filled with human and horse corpses. They finally saw the hope of charging out. "Charge with me!" Akmu, who saw the hope of survival, had a black face. Although his personal guards had tried their best to protect him from being burned to death, the smell of smoke and fire did not feel good. Now that he finally had a chance to show off his skills, he hollered out and was about to launch a counterattack. At this moment, Akma had close to 1,000 soldiers who could still fight. There were also 2,000 to 3,000 injured soldiers. Although they couldn't win with these, it was still possible to carve out a path of blood. In the hearts of many Mongolian cavalry, they were invincible on their horses. They were like their ancestors, invincible on their horses. It was good to have confidence, but too much confidence was asking for death. Especially when they were facing the elites of the 5-star army, who specialized in beating up the Mongolian cavalry. From the moment they charged, their fates were already decided. "Soldiers, charge with me!" Tianhu, who had been waiting by the side, pulled out his 2 cavalry swords. He had wanted to experience the skills of the Siberian Mongol cavalry. If it was not for Yang Qindong's plan, he would have charged out long ago. Luckily, there were still a few thousand enemies left on the battlefield, which was enough for the No. 1 Cavalry Army to practice their swords. A truly strong army did not depend on how hard they trained. Instead, they needed to have enough battle experience. Soldiers who had not been on the battlefield were all fake and could only be considered armchair strategists. Luckily, the world was huge, and there were many whetstones for the 5-star army. After Tianhu gave the order, the cavalry surged out behind him. It was as if everyone knew that there was more soup than meat, and they were afraid that if they were late, they would not be able to obtain any merits. The wolves moved, and after the soldiers of the No. 1 Cavalry Army charged, a killing intent filled the sky as they charged at the charging Mongolian cavalry. That killing intent seemed to have turned into a physical aura that charged into the enemy camp. For some reason, including Akma, many of the Mongolian cavalry could not help but feel a chill run down their spines. This was the manifestation of the killing intent turning into a physical form. It was like a butcher. After killing so many pigs, even if they were alive, they could not help but shiver. The charge of the Mongolian cavalry did not stop because of this. They were like how they dealt with the small Russian tribes, spreading out and trying to use the wolf pack tactic to split up and win. Although they felt a chill in their bones when they charged, since they chose to charge, they would not stop for no reason. Arrow formation. Tianhu, who was charging at the front, had no intention of stopping either. This was not the first time they had faced a pack of wolves, so they used the short arrow formation to charge forward as if they were familiar with it. Countless facts had proven that the Mongolian cavalry were not scary. They just needed to maintain their hearts and charge according to what they had learned in their training. Chapter 1383. This was one of the important instructions Yang Qindong gave to the army. When they faced a strong enemy, they were not to be easily moved by them. They would fight their own battles, and they would fight their own battles. They were not to change because of the enemy. If that happened, they would be giving up on their advantage and letting the enemy take advantage of them. In truth, this was often the treasure that decided the outcome of a battle between powerful players. When a weak player ran into a strong player, their rhythm would usually be messed up. In fact, to protect their lives, they would have no choice but to adapt to the enemy's fighting style. In the end, they would only have the strength to fight back and would not be able to attack at all. How could they not lose? On the other hand, if they fought in the style they were most familiar with, even though there was a high chance that they would lose, they could at least threaten the enemy. If they were lucky, it was not impossible for them to heavily injure the enemy and turn defeat into victory. As the strongest army among cold weapons and the world's best cavalier army that had just been expanded into an army, Commander Tian Hu would often use Yang Chendong's words to teach his soldiers. Along with the fact that they were stronger than the enemy to begin with and the morale they gained after winning, the moment both sides clashed, Akmu was shocked to find that he was about to lose. In terms of strength, the five-star army waited patiently, and the Mongolian cavaliers who were attacking could not compare to them. In terms of weapons, the soldiers of the world's best cavalier army were all equipped with divine sabers, and their advantage was clear. As long as the enemy dared to fight against them head-on, they would be cut in half after 3 slashes, and they would not be able to continue fighting. In terms of morale, the Mongolian cavaliers had just suffered a great defeat, and all the soldiers were like birds that were startled by the twang of a bow. On the other hand, the five-star army had just obtained a great victory, and everyone's confidence was high. This made them even more decisive when they attacked, and the gap between them and the enemy increased by a large margin. When comparing them, the difference in strength was obvious. It could be said that before the battle even started, the victor had already been decided. A tiger had entered a pack of wolves, and it was not just one tiger, but a tiger that had more people than a pack of wolves. The pressure it brought to the Mongolian cavaliers could be easily seen. After fighting for around 15 minutes, Akmu was shocked to find that he could not even use half of the strength he had before. The number of casualties continued to increase, especially as the number of times they clashed increased. Many of the sabers in the Mongolian cavaliers' hands were cut in half, and they were at a disadvantage in terms of weapons. The speed at which they lost became even faster. Protect the general and open up a bloody path. Around a dozen of his remaining personal guards protected Akim. When they saw that the Mongolian cavaliers were about to leave, these personal guards shouted in unison and gathered together to charge out of the corner surrounded by the five-star army. Let me do it! A warhorse suddenly rushed out from Yang Chendong's side. Needless to say, that tall figure and that deafening voice belonged to none other than Beta Persei. Speaking of which, Beta Persei also had the courage of 1,000 men. He had been by Yang Chendong's side for many years and could receive pointers at any time. When it came to individual combat power, even in the five-star army, there were few who could match him. Usually, he had to protect the safety of the sixth young master, so he did not have many chances to go to the battlefield. Now that the situation was set, he was itching to fight. When he saw that there were a dozen enemy cavaliers who wanted to escape, he did not hold back and immediately rode his horse away. The dozen Mongolian cavaliers were unusually fierce as they protected Akim and destroyed the path that the five-star army had blocked. They formed a large force and charged out of the battlefield. To be able to become Akim's personal guards, their skills were naturally not bad. Although they did not create the 18 shadow guards or the 12 protectors, they were all strong men who could fight against 10 or even dozens of people. If they gathered their strength together, normal five-star army soldiers would not be able to block them. This could be seen from the fact that they had only lost 4 people even though they had injured more than a dozen five-star army cavaliers along the way. And just when they had already charged through a few blockade lines and were about to break out of the encirclement and escape, a war horse and a tall figure blocked their path. Without any warning, the person rushed in front of them and raised his saber to slash down. Waves of great force crashed into the sabers of the Mongolian personal guards, and a great pressure came from their arms. Cling cling clang clang, clang 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 clang. It was as if he had entered a realm where no one could stop him. Block, block, chop, lift, sweep, press. All sorts of attacks were displayed by young heir on horseback. His movements were quick and steady, and he suppressed the Mongolian cavaliers who seemed to be unstoppable a moment ago to the point that they were forced to retreat. Fall! The saber slashed down fiercely and hit the chest of a Mongolian cavalier. The great force caused the cavalier's saber to break, and the blade was also wedged into the cavalier's sternum. The cavalier fell off his horse. "Get down from your horses!" Once the saber was pulled out from the chest of a Mongolian cavalier, it was raised and flicked, and it hit another Mongolian cavalier who was charging at him. After the saber sliced through the cavalier's arm, another Mongolian cavalier cried out in pain and fell off his horse. Get down, all of you!" The man and horse quickly weaved through the Mongolian cavaliers. His saber was like a nimble snake, and the Mongolian cavaliers around him were either cut down, flicked, or pressed down from their horses. No one was able to withstand a single blow from him. "Sixth young master, second brother's strength has increased again." When the captain of the first team, Chiu Vi, saw this scene, he could not help but sigh in amazement. At the same time, he was eager to give it a try. Even though he could not compare to Beta Persei's position in Yang Chendong's eyes, because he was close to him, he had received a lot of pointers. He really wanted to go up and see how strong he was. Beta Persei is a person who is willing to work hard. Let's see, these people might not be enough for him to kill alone. Yang Chendong's gaze was like a torch, and he spoke with the gaze of a grandmaster. As the saying went, once an expert made a move, the truth would be revealed. Even though Beta Persei's strength was much weaker than his, normal Mongolian cavaliers could no longer stop him. Since Yang Chendong had said this, Chiu Vi could only suppress the thought of going up to help Beta Persei. Then, he stared at the battlefield with his eyes wide open. He wanted to learn how Beta Persei fought. Many times, watching a battle between experts was also an experience of enlightenment, and it was also a rare opportunity. In the battlefield, Beta Persei killed more than 10 Mongolian cavaliers in a short period of time, and finally faced off against General Akhma. As the great general of Siberia, Khan Hirahan, Akhma did not rely on flattery to get to his position. He was a person with real instincts. Before he met the 5-star army. No! It should be said that before he fell into the trap tonight, Akhma was very arrogant. In his eyes, the Han people were as weak as sheep. They were not even as weak as the Russians who dared to resist them from time to time. Since the 5-star army was mainly made up of Han people, there was no such thing as being strong or powerful. As long as he arrived with the army, one charge would be enough to scare the opponent. Then, it would be the autumn wind sweeping away the fallen leaves, and the pursuit of the enemy would be a great victory. It was precisely because he thought that everything was too simple and too easy. When he found out that he was surrounded, Akhma was shocked. He finally knew that the Han people he faced this time were different from the Han people in the past. They had some ability. However, this ability was nothing more than relying on schemes and trickery to win. If it was face to face, blade to blade, he was confident that he would be able to beat the crap out of these Han people. As a result, there was the scene of him leading the army to counterattack. Then, the confidence in his heart was thrown away one by one. What did they mean that he accidentally fell into a trap? What did they mean that the Han people were weak and easy to bully? Right now, Akhma only wanted to kill all those who had spread the news. If the Han people were easy to bully, then who was the one who beat him up? After failing time and time again, breaking through the bottom line of his heart, Akhma no longer had the heart to fight against the 5-star army. This was because he found that even if there were no schemes or traps, he would not be able to gain any advantage against the 5-star army. The only difference was that the other party would have to pay a higher price. However, the result of the battle could not be changed. He would definitely lose and the Han people would win. If he could escape this time, Akhma would definitely tell Great Khan Hirahan to retreat as far away as possible from the 5-star army. The Han people were simply devils, executioners who killed without batting an eyelid. On the contrary, they were like clowns who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. They were so ignorant, so arrogant, and so reckless. However, it was clearly too late for him to think of all this at this time. At this time, Akhma was already a little scared. If it was possible, if he was not a great general, perhaps he would choose to surrender in order to survive. However, at this time, he had no other choice. With the trust and support that Houlihan had given him over the years, even if he had to fight to the death, he would not say a word about surrendering. Young Heir's chest heaved up and down as he went on a killing spree. After all, he had killed and injured more than a dozen people, so his physical strength was somewhat depleted. Even so, when facing Acme, he was still full of pride and said, "Seeing that you are still a general, I will give you a chance. If you don't want to die, surrender." Different from the cloth armor that the other Mongolian cavalry wore, Acme wore metal armor. Moreover, it was not the half-metal armor that normal soldiers wore. Instead, it was a full metal armor that protected his body. Just based on this, his identity should not be simple. Beta Persei wanted to capture this person alive. It would be a great achievement. Looking at Beta Persei, Acme quickly shook his head. "You are very strong, but this general will never surrender. My soul has long returned to Tingri. Even if you kill me now, it will not be long before I will be a hero again." "Tingri my ass," Beta Persei muttered. He had long known from young Chinong that the so-called Tingri was like the god that the Han people talked about. It was a kind of belief and a kind of spiritual support. It did not exist at all. Of course, he also knew that many Mongolians respected Tingri. If anyone said anything bad about them, they would immediately become the public enemy. He would not do such a stupid thing. Chapter 1384. Beta Persei's eyes became brighter as he cursed Acme's ignorance in his heart. "Since he won't surrender, then I'll just kill him. I hope he's not too weak so I can fight to my heart's content." Slowly raising his sword and arm, Beta Persei assumed a posture of a life-and-death battle. Similarly, Acme also raised his saber and raised it high up in the air. When their eyes met, the word "kill" came out of their mouths almost at the same time. Then the war horses under both sides let out a neigh, and the two men quickly approached each other. One was the great general of the Siberian Mongol cavalry. He held a high position, was unusually brave, and had experienced hundreds of battles. The other was the leader of the 5-star army. He was a close subordinate of Yang Xie's leader, Yang Chendong. He had extraordinary strength, and the power of his sword was mighty. The so-called strongest of the strongest referred to them. In the process of rushing, when the war horses crossed, the two sabers quickly collided and separated in an instant. In the first round, they were evenly matched, and it looked like they were evenly matched. After galloping for a distance, the two men turned their horses around and stared at each other. After the exchange, the two men didn't seem any different from before. But if one looked carefully, they could still see the differences. For example, Beta Persei's indifferent face, the tension in Acme's eyes, and his slightly trembling right arm. With the advantage of the weapon, Young Heir, who was holding the heavenly saber, could release all of his strength to the maximum when fighting. He didn't have to worry about the weapon breaking down. In contrast, Acme couldn't do the same. After seeing the scene of many soldiers' weapons being broken, he was afraid of the 5-star army's sabers. This made him not dare to use all his strength in the fight because he wasn't sure if the saber in his hand was strong enough to break in two. The fear in his heart, and the inability to use all his strength weakened his momentum and confidence by at least 30%. In a battle between experts, a small mistake could be fatal. Who would dare to not use their full strength? It could be said that with the advantage of the toughness of the weapon, Beta Persei had already gained the upper hand before the battle even began. The tremendous force behind the blow had already caused Acme's arm to feel sore and numb, showing signs of defeat. "Ha ha ha, you and I had a fair fight. How delightful!" Again! Beta Persei laughed heartily as he felt the exhilaration of releasing his power. After a loud shout, he urged his horse forward. "Fair my ass!" Acme cursed in his heart. Due to the disadvantage of his weapon, he didn't dare to use his full strength. Naturally, he couldn't display his full strength. Now that he saw Beta Persei rushing over again, he had no choice but to bite the bullet and charge forward. Ding ding dang dang dang. After another clash, Beta Persei laughed again and launched another charge, forcing Acma to passively attack again and again. In just a short while, the two sides had clashed for at least 10 rounds. Finally, the saber in Acma's hand broke into two. Although the quality of the weapon in his hand was extraordinary as a supreme general, there was still a huge gap between his weapon and Yang Xie's more mature forging skills. It was already very difficult for him to hold on until now. Not only that, because he didn't dare to use his full strength, Acma had been enduring the tremendous force from Beta Persei on his wrist. At this time, his right arm had become red and swollen, and it was difficult for him to even lift the saber. "Hey! Why did your saber break by itself? Are you afraid of your grandfather? Well, if that's the case, why don't you surrender? You seem to have some ability. If you surrender, your grandfather will spare your life. How about it?" Beta Persei seemed to have just noticed the other party's broken saber, and said jokingly. Acma's face was flushed red. He was furious and infuriated. After so many years of fighting, this was the first time he heard that a saber could be afraid of people. Knowing that Beta Persei was humiliating him, Acma glared at him and said, "If you want to fight, then fight. You're a vile person with a sharp tongue. Humph! You're courting death." Seeing that Acma still had no intention of surrendering, Beta Persei was also enraged. After a roar, he urged his horse to charge again. This time, he wouldn't hold back and vowed to cut down his opponent. Beta Persei wasn't worried about whether or not he could kill Acma. Since the young master didn't say anything to stop him, it wouldn't be a problem to kill this person. Since that was the case, he didn't have any worries and just focused on fighting with all his might. Acma held half of the saber in his hand and his expression was ugly. But he didn't have the slightest intention of surrendering. A general had died in 100 battles. Since he had won the war, he had to be prepared to die. He only hated himself for being careless this time. Not only did he not have long to live, but he also implicated nearly 10,000 soldiers to die here. In the end, he still failed to live up to the Khan's trust. Acma, who already had the intention to die, didn't have any more worries. The worst outcome was nothing more than death. How could a person who wasn't even afraid of death be afraid of Beta Persei's saber? Acma, who was holding half of the saber in his hand, charged forward without any intention of dodging. He launched the last attack of his life. Beta Persei finally felt that something was wrong. As the distance between the two sides got closer and closer, the other party didn't have the slightest intention of dodging. There was only an indomitable momentum and an attitude of mutual destruction. Beta Persei, who didn't want to die with Acma, had no choice but to change the direction of his saber midway. The saber also changed from a slash to a sweep and fiercely slapped Acma's body. The powerful saber slapped Acma's chest, and he immediately spat out a mouthful of blood. Even a tree branch could exert a great amount of power, let alone a saber. Blood gushed out of Acma's mouth as he was struck. Acma forcefully gathered his strength and swept his saber across Yang Second's black armor, leaving a mark on it. But it was only a shallow mark. The attack range of the broken saber was limited, which allowed Beta Persei to escape. After noticing the saber mark on the armor, Beta Persei first took a deep breath. He didn't dare to imagine what the result would be if the other party didn't use a broken saber, but a whole saber. In other words, he was almost injured by the other party. If he wanted to kill his own people, he had to kill them first. Beta Persei would not allow a defeated general to threaten him. After shouting angrily, he raised his saber and slashed back. This slash used almost 90% of his strength. Acma, who had just swung his saber and used up all his strength, had a regretful expression on his face. He was so close to beheading the general of the 5-star army. Just as he was feeling regretful, he felt a cold wind coming from above his head. When he raised his head again, a sharp saber was falling towards his head. It was already dark. Although there were torches around, it was still difficult to see. Acma only saw the shadow of a saber flash above his head, and then an indescribable pain attacked his whole body. After struggling for a while, Acma's chest suddenly split open and blood gushed out. Then, he lowered his head and saw that his body had been split in half. Akma's nose twitched as he could no longer breathe in oxygen. His body trembled a few times before he fell off the horse and onto the ground, forever losing his consciousness and senses. Who? Beta Persei, who had killed Akma, let out a long sigh. Reality told him that if he underestimated any opponent, he would have to pay a heavy price. If it wasn't for the fact that the other party was holding a broken blade, the one who would be lying on the ground right now would be him. With Akma killed, the other Mongol soldiers who were lucky enough to survive were either killed or surrendered. Before the sun rose, the battle had already ended. Of the 8,000 Mongol cavalry that charged into the ambush, not a single one managed to escape. The battle on the main battlefield had already ended. Outside the Amuga River, the battle was still ongoing. When the 2,000 Mongol cavalry saw that the main force of the army had fallen into the Five-Star Army's trap, they turned around and fled. The previous scene had already told them that tonight's ambush had failed. It was not difficult for the 8,000 Mongol cavalry to not be able to escape. Since they had already lost, it was impossible for them to turn the situation around with just 2,000 people. Rather than continuing to die, they might as well escape and report this matter to the Khan. The 2,000 Mongol cavalry retreated. However, before they could run 5 miles, Nanlidi brought a Hachi, who had come to report, and a group of cavalry to welcome them. While they were still far away, Nanlidi's voice rang out first. "Are the people in front our brothers? We are here to support you." Before the battle had even started, a Hachi had been released by Akma so that he could find Nanlidi and ask him to send troops together. He had purposely notified them a little later so that Akma would not steal the credit from him. However, what he did not expect was that what awaited him was not credit but death. Of course, even if Akma had notified Nanlidi in advance, he would have found all sorts of reasons to delay. The one in control of the army was not him, but Ba Daojiang and the 1st Division Commander Taimur. They led 4,000 troops and waited here for the chance to deal the final blow to the Mongol cavalry. When the flames in the camp soared into the sky, the 4,000 cavalry finally moved. They galloped all the way and killed any fish that fell into the net. The 2,000 Mongol cavalry that had escaped were unfortunately stopped by them. After losing contact with their commander, the 2,000 Mongol cavalry were defeated by a wave of Five-Star Army. The cavalry fled in all directions and rushed into the surrounding forest. With Tian Yi and Lin Duo, even 40,000 cavalrymen would not be able to surround the entire area, let alone 4,000 cavalrymen. Ba Daojiang and Taimur could only watch as the scattered Mongolian soldiers escaped. They focused their attention on the main force of the Mongolian cavalry. Compared to the main battlefield, the battle on this side of the battlefield had already ended a step earlier. The final tally was that they had captured and killed around 1,600 cavalry. This meant that at least 400 Mongol cavalry had escaped during the night. When they reported this to Yang Chidong, he was not surprised. He only said, "The army should use the time to clean up the battlefield and rest. Tomorrow afternoon, we will set off for Arching." Since they had already revealed their tracks and displayed their strength, in order to prevent Hurahan from escaping with the army, they had to speed up their march. Even so, Yang Chidong did not have the confidence to kill all the enemies. This was caused by the environment. The Far East region was filled with forests, lakes, and mountains. If someone wanted to hide in such an area, finding them would be as difficult as finding a needle in a haystack. Chapter 1385. Arching City. 3 days later, when Kagan Hulahan was still waiting for good news from General Akma, an unexpected piece of news was delivered to him. When the cavalry who had escaped from the front lines knelt down in front of him and described the situation at the front lines, Hulahan felt the sky darken and he almost fainted. Akma had actually been defeated. Not only that, but his own life and death were unknown. Of the 10,000 Mongolian cavalry under him, less than 400 had returned. This result was completely out of Hulahan's expectations. Since the Five-Star Army only had 10,000 people, even if they could not win, they should be able to retreat safely. They were the Mongolian cavalry, a race that had grown up on horseback. Compared to the Hans who were not good at riding, they had a natural advantage. In fact, many times on the battlefield, they looked down on their Hans opponents. Houlihan fainted. His subordinates tried to save him, pinching his philtrum and splashing cold water on him, before finally waking him up. After waking up, Houlihan first accepted the fact that they had lost, but he still did not believe that Acma would be fine. He was very clear about Acma's abilities, and ordinary people would not be able to catch him. Furthermore, he had a large army, so he believed that he would definitely be able to break out of the encirclement. Just as Houlihan regained his composure, Belinsky walked in from outside the door. He first bowed to Houlihan and then asked with concern, "I heard that the Great Khan is not feeling well. I have already found the best doctor in the city. They are waiting outside the residence and can examine the Great Khan at any time." "No need, this Khan's body is very good." Houlihan waved his hand. He did not trust the Han's doctors, not to mention that he was not sick. He had only fainted because he was too anxious. However, no matter what, Belinsky had good intentions. This time, they were able to take down Arching City because of him. A look of hesitation flashed across Houlihan's face, but he quickly said with determination, "Let me tell you something. General Acma fell into the Han's trap and lost the battle." "What?" Belinsky's expression changed when he heard this. He was indeed unaware of this news. After all, news of Acma's death had only just reached the city. This news caused Belinsky's expression to change drastically. At the same time, he asked suspiciously, "Great Khan, is this true? Was this news personally sent by General Acma? But where is the general now?" "The news didn't come from Acma. It came from the cavalry he brought with him. Don't worry, this news is reliable. The battle is definitely won. As for Acma's whereabouts, even I don't know." While shaking his head, Houlihan angrily slammed the table and said, "The 5-star army has gone too far. They actually dared to set a trap for me. They are truly despicable. This enmity must be avenged." Houlihan did have a reason to be angry. No one would be in a good mood after being taught a lesson by someone they had always looked down on. But why didn't he think about it? If he hadn't targeted the Far Eastern Army first, how could the 5-star army find trouble with them so quickly? Houlihan was still sulking. Belinsky indeed wouldn't. Although he was a merchant, it was because of this that he placed benefits and safety more than anyone else. The Mongol cavalry was known as a race on horseback. They had always been the ones to kill. When had they ever been killed or lost a battle? At the very least, from what he knew, when the Russian tribes faced the Mongol cavalry, they had mostly lost. The 5-star army was actually so powerful that they could defeat the elite Mongol cavalry. Didn't that mean they were even more powerful? He had actually offended such a powerful person. Didn't that mean he was no longer safe? "No, I have to leave. I have to leave the 5-star army." In this chaotic world, Belinsky, who had always viewed his life as the most important, quickly made a decision. In order to leave this place safely, he had to ask Houlihan to bring him along. Otherwise, whether it was in the Far East or in the Siberian region, he would not have a foothold in the future. Belinsky, who had made up his mind, looked at Houlihan and organized his words before saying, "Great Khan, the 5-star army is so powerful. We shouldn't fight them head-on." "HM? What? Do you really think this Khan is afraid of them? This time, they only defeated Acma because they schemed. Even if they can win, they must have suffered heavy losses. Now, this Khan still has more than 15,000 elite cavalry. This Khan is still confident that we can defeat them." Houlihan wouldn't admit defeat so easily. Although his bloodline wasn't pure and he couldn't be considered a member of the Golden family, he was still a descendant of Genghis Khan. He was still very proud in his bones. Seeing that Houlihan was still so stubborn, Belinsky scolded him for being stupid in his heart. On the surface, he had to put on a serious expression and said, "The Great Khan's might is naturally not something that the Han people can match. However, the problem now is that not only do we have the 5-star army as our enemy, we also have the Far Eastern Army behind us. Previously, we were unprepared and caught them off guard, so they had no choice but to hide. However, now that their reinforcements are here, they will definitely jump out and become enemies with the Great Khan. When that time comes, the Great Khan won't have any advantage in terms of military strength. Even if we can win in the end, the Great Khan's strength will also be heavily injured. In that case, if other forces enter this place, what will we use to defend against them? This. Hulahan wanted to say that as long as he was here, they wouldn't be defeated by the 5-star army. However, after considering that if they really won in a Pyrrhic victory, once their strength was severely damaged, it was inevitable that there would be despicable people who would target them. There were no laws here, nor was there any so-called justice. Everything was based on the law of the jungle where the strong preyed on the weak. If they didn't have enough strength, then they deserved to be bullied. Hulahan wouldn't watch his strength be damaged and be looked down upon by others. If that was the case, what was the use of occupying Archon? Thinking of this, his thoughts of fighting to the death with the 5-star army couldn't help but waver. Seeing that Hulahan didn't say anything, Belinsky knew that his suggestion was effective. He immediately followed up. Great Khan, the Han people have a saying, where there is life, there is hope. As long as the Great Khan is still here, this one is still here. If you and I work together, I will provide the money and you will provide the manpower. The Han people also have a saying, it's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge. Today, the 5-star army made us suffer. Let's remember this first. We will get our revenge sooner or later. As Belinsky consoled him, he also repeated his own importance. In the end, he was telling Hulahan that he was very important and that he had to bring him along when he left. Hulahan, who didn't think too much, didn't know what Belinsky was thinking. He was only considering whether Belinsky's words were correct. Just like how Belinsky valued his own life, Belinsky naturally didn't want to die. Not only that, he also valued his own strength. Since he was young, he had seen too many unfair things. He also respected the truth, which was that the one with the biggest fist was the absolute truth. As long as you had enough strength, you could set the rules. On the other hand, if you were weak, even if what you said was correct, no one would listen to you. He thought about how he wasn't the only armed force in Siberia, and he wasn't even the only Great Khan. If his strength was weakened too much, he was afraid that he wouldn't even have a place to stay when he returned this time. Since he wasn't confident that he could win, and there wouldn't be enough benefits even if he won, why would he fight this battle? Instead of taking the risk, it was better to retreat first. Just like what Belinsky said, he should preserve his strength first. Revenge could wait until he was stronger, right? Okay. After thinking it through, Hulahan slapped his thigh and said, You're right, we don't have to fight to the death with the 5-star army. Since that's the case, why don't we retreat first? How about this? This Khan will immediately order the army to prepare to leave. When the time comes, we won't leave anything behind for the 5-star army. This Khan wants to leave them a mess and give them a headache. Chapter 1386. Belinsky sighed in his heart. This Hulahan might be good at fighting and killing, but when it came to scheming and plotting, he was a far cry from that. It was probably because there was no one else in the Mongolian army that he was able to get the position. Great Khan, Tang Xing is a surrender general, but he has not truly joined us. Before, it was only because we captured his tribesmen and forced him to join us. Now that he's with his clansmen, no one knows if he'll really listen to us. People like him are unstable elements in the army. Since that's the case, why don't we leave him here and let him lead the troops to deal with the Far Eastern army? Isn't that killing two birds with one stone? After he leaves, our army will leave the city. At that time, it will be the Han people's problem. If they want to kill each other, we can just kill them. There will be no losses for us. What do you think, Great Khan? After finally speaking his thoughts, Belinsky looked into Hulahan's eyes with anticipation. HM? HM. That makes sense. Hulahan took a while to digest these words, then nodded his head heavily. He was a selfish person and would not easily trust others. In his eyes, the remaining 15,000 Mongol cavalry were the most loyal. Even Belinsky could be abandoned at any time, let alone Tang Xing. If it was not for the fact that Tang Xing still held the authority of the 2nd Cavalry Division, he would not even look at him. Now that he could leave safely by abandoning Tang Xing, it was definitely worth it. He nodded and said, "That's fine. I'll leave this matter to you. The sooner the better." "Yes." Belinsky nodded heavily. Although he was not willing to do such a thing, if he left it to Hulahin, it could easily cause problems. For his own safety and the safety of his assets, he had to do it personally. After leaving the Great Khan's residence, Belinsky went straight to Tang Xing's residence. Ever since his clansmen had been found and sent to All City, Tang Xing had arranged for them to stay in his courtyard. Along with some of his personal guards, although the courtyard was not big, there were quite a few people. There were close to 500 people. When Belinsky arrived, he felt that it was very lively. When Belinsky arrived, Tang Xing, who had received the news, immediately came to welcome him. The two of them went to the study and asked everyone to leave. When Tang Xing saw Belinsky's cautious expression, he had a bad feeling. Until the other party spoke, he knew that his premonition was not wrong. "General Tang, a great disaster is about to befall you," Belinsky said with a long sigh, as if he was very concerned about Tang Xing. "Why?" Tang Xing was so shocked that he stood up from his chair with a look of horror on his face. Ever since he rebelled against the Far Eastern Army, Tang Xing hadn't had a good night's sleep. As a traitor, especially before his old master was killed, he needed to be on guard against revenge and all kinds of methods that could be used against him. Especially in the past few days, the entire All City had been in chaos. The people living here, whether it was their personal safety or their property, were greatly threatened. Facing the Mongol cavalry who only knew how to plunder and didn't know how to manage and produce, the people were already complaining and dissatisfied. Sometimes, even he would feel angry when he saw the Mongol cavalry's actions. They were simply a group of bandits who didn't talk reason and only did things based on their emotions. They didn't care about the people's feelings at all. However, because they had cavalry swords in their hands that could kill, the people didn't dare to say anything. Because of this, many people vented their anger on him. Even though he also held a certain amount of military power, the people weren't bold enough to attack his residence, and no one dared to truly make a move against him. However, when he walked on the streets, he could still feel the unconcealed anger of the people when they looked at him with gazes. He had offended the Far Eastern Army, offended the people in the city, and the 5-star army had sent reinforcements. It would be strange if Tang Xing was in a good mood. As a result, there were many times when he began to doubt whether his actions back then were right or wrong. For the sake of his less than 200 clansmen, he had betrayed the interests of tens of thousands of Far East soldiers and hundreds of thousands of people. Did he do something wrong? While he was reflecting on himself, Tang Xing was also very afraid of death. He was afraid that some people who couldn't touch the Mongol cavalry would target him. Therefore, when he went out, he doubled the number of guards. Even when he slept at home, he arranged many guards outside to protect him. However, even so, he was still unable to sleep until dawn. Often, the slightest movement would wake him up. Now that Belinsky had come and said that he was in trouble, how could he not be afraid? "Mr. Tang, what's going on? Back then I listened to you and rebelled against the Far Eastern Army. Now you can't leave me alone." Tang Xing suddenly grabbed Belinsky's arm and said with a pleading expression, "Don't be agitated, don't be agitated." Belinsky was in a good mood. Originally, he thought that it would take some effort to scare Tang Xing. But now, it seemed that he was simply a bird that was startled by the twang of a bow, so the following things would be much easier. After patting Tang Xing's arm and making a comforting gesture, Belinsky frowned. After thinking for a while, he said to Tang Xing, who was listening seriously, "General Tang, I'm sure you can tell that the Khan is a suspicious person. He doesn't really trust you, right?" "Yes." Tang Xing nodded. Half of his blood was Han Chinese. Just based on this, it would be extremely difficult to make Houlihan trust him. Yes, the Khan is somewhat suspicious of you. Previously, someone went to the Khan and complained to him, saying that you only surrendered to the Khan on the surface, but secretly had other thoughts and that you were still in contact with the Far Eastern Army. No, absolutely not. Tang Xing, who had just sat down, suddenly stood up again with a thump. His face was red. This time, he was really anxious. The feeling of being wronged was not good. He would never admit to something he did not do. Don't worry, your subordinate will speak, your subordinate will speak. Belinsky comforted him again, then said, I absolutely trust the general. You have already stabbed the Far Eastern Army. How could you still be in contact with them? I also went to the Khan about this matter and told him that you are innocent. Thank you, thank you. Tang Xing wiped the sweat on his forehead and said gratefully, Don't thank me. In fact, this matter is not over. I only temporarily dispelled the Khan's suspicion of you. If you want the Khan to completely believe you, you still need to do something. Belinsky began to lead the topic to the trap. Sure enough, when he heard that there was a solution, Tang Xing asked with a face full of curiosity. Please teach me, Mr. Tang. I can't say that I'll teach you, but if the general can lead the troops to deal with the Far Eastern Army, wouldn't that be the best way to prove yourself? At that time, once you can capture the Far Eastern Army's commander, or even severely injure the Far Eastern Army, who would dare to doubt you? At that time, not only will the Khan completely trust you, it is also possible that he will give you great power. When he heard that he had to become enemies with the Far Eastern Army, Tang Xing's face immediately turned ugly. When Belinsky instigated him to rebel, he said that it would be best if he could capture Chenbo. If he couldn't, he only needed to open the gates of Arch. In the future, he wouldn't need to do anything to deal with the Far Eastern Army. But now, it was a different story. Tang Xing wanted to remind the other party of the promise he made to him. But after thinking about it, what was the point of saying it? Right now, Houlihan didn't trust him. If he didn't quickly solve this problem, who knew when the Mongolian cavalry would visit his home? If that happened, would he and his clansmen still have a way to live? There was no choice. It wasn't a matter of whether he was willing or not, but he had to do it. Otherwise, a disaster would be right in front of him. Phew! Tang Xing exhaled. His face didn't look good, but there were still some things that needed to be said and some promises that needed to be made. Mr. Tang, since doing this can eliminate the Khan's suspicion of me, I will lead the troops to deal with the Far Eastern Army. Belinsky was very happy that Tang Xing agreed so easily. But in order to make sure that the other party didn't do nothing, he continued to promise. That's good. If that's the case, no one will be able to slander the general. That's right, the general only needs to lead the troops. I will ask the Khan to send troops to help you. When the time comes, we will deal with the Far Eastern Army and have done a great service. I hope the general won't forget my contribution. Of course, of course. Tang Xing was relieved when he heard that the Mongolian cavalry would help him. He had hidden many spies in the Far Eastern Army. Those people were like him, not pure Han people. They wouldn't be loyal to the Far Eastern Army. With these spies and the help of the 2nd Cavalry Division and the Mongolian soldiers, it wouldn't be difficult to deal with the Far Eastern Army that had already been discovered. Tang Xing agreed and personally sent Belinsky out of the residence with a look of gratitude. At the same time, he promised that he would gather the troops now and leave the city tomorrow morning to find the Far Eastern Army. Good news would come soon. Tang Xing didn't know that he had been completely used by Belinsky and abandoned by Houlihan. He had become an abandoned pawn and had to cover for the Mongolian army's departure. It could be said that he had made the best use of everything. Chapter 1387. Belinsky happily went to see Houlihan. First, he explained Tang Xing's attitude. Then, he suggested that the moment Tang Xing left the city the next day, they would seal the city and loot the entire city. They would take everything that could be used or taken away and quickly leave this place. They would return to Siberia to recuperate and prepare for the next battle. Houlihan happily accepted Belinsky's suggestion. However, at the same time, he was also alarmed. This merchant was too cunning, so much so that he had to be wary. He even wondered if he could kill this merchant if he had the chance. When the time came, he would be able to obtain the merchant's wealth and avoid a huge danger. Wouldn't that be the best of both worlds? Unfortunately, Belinsky did not know this. He was still fantasizing about how he could expand his caravan in Siberia with Houlihan's support. He even thought that without Acme, Houlihan would be in urgent need of talents. He should have the ability to take over this position. This was the difference between a merchant and a ruthless person. Merchants thought more about benefits and how to make use of each other in a win-win situation. Ruthless people were different. They mostly did things based on their hearts. Once they realized that there was danger, they would kill without any reason. As for the consequences, that was something to be discussed in the future. As for Tang Xing, after receiving Belinsky's reminder, he began to gather his troops that afternoon. After bringing enough rations for 5 days, he bade farewell to his clansmen early the next morning and led his troops out of Arching. Not long after he left the city gates were closed. At the same time, they began to loot. In order not to attract attention, there was no fire in the city. Everything that could be looted was looted, and those that could not be taken away were smashed. For a time, the city was in a mess. Even General Tang Xing's residence did not escape. Belinsky personally led the army to charge in, and then there was a round of looting. Tang Xing was a division commander. When he chased Chenbo and the others away, he took a lot of good things. Now, they were all in the treasury. Now, Belinsky had benefited from them. When they saw the boxes of good things being carried out of the Tang residence, the clansmen who stayed behind to guard the residence could not take it anymore. They all went forward to stop these actions. This made Belinsky unhappy. Since he had decided to go all the way, he gave the order and the Mongol cavalry began to kill. Very quickly, the Tang manor was filled with blood and the stench of blood filled the air. Even after all of the clansmen had died, many of them still had their eyes wide open, as if they had died with a grievance. They really couldn't imagine that the person who came to the residence yesterday and was sent away by Tang Xing with endless gratitude would suddenly reveal killing intent today and kill all of them. What exactly was going on? The chaos in all city also affected the intelligence personnel of the 5-star army in the city. However, because some of them were dressed like beggars and had no money, they did not attract the attention of the Mongolian soldiers. When the situation in the city became more and more chaotic, the intelligence personnel used a new battery that had just been sent into the city to turn on the radio and broadcast the situation outside. At this moment, young Chendong was leading his army towards Arching. At this time, the number of troops had reached nearly 20,000. Apart from the 10,000 soldiers, there were also many Mongol captives as well as many Russian clansmen nearby. 3 battles, 3 victories, and Yang Chendong used his actions to prove the strength of the 5-star army. He also attracted the respect of some hot-blooded Russians like Nikolaev. They had even expressed their desire to join the 5-star army. Once they entered Arching, they would be able to achieve their wish. This was Yang Chendong. No matter what the situation was, he could always make the troops grow like a snowball. In the end, they would become a colossus that would strike fear into the bones of all his opponents. As the army was advancing, the intelligence report from Arching was sent over. When the telegram was sent to Yang Chendong, his first thought was that the enemy was about to run. "Tell Commander Tian Hu to come over immediately." The target had been exposed, so it was time to start a fire. Under the constant cooling, Chenbo fell into a deep sleep once again. This time, it was different from the past. Chenbo had really fallen asleep. His breathing was steady, and his body's vital signs were also constantly recovering. It was only a matter of time before his body fully recovered. As for the military matters of the Far Eastern Army, before Chenbo fell asleep, he gave all the power to Commander Daikwa. As the person who followed Yang Chendong to the Far East, Daikwa had seen the strength of the 5-star army. His loyalty to Yang Chendong was not something that the other commanders could compare to. Chenbo was relieved to give the power to this person. After Daiqua obtained the military power, the first thing he did was to take out the tiger talisman that Qinbo gave him. He sent someone to inform the 3rd Cavalry Division and the 5th Cavalry Division. He also allowed Commander Kong He to return to the army and lead the 2nd Cavalry Division to gather at the military headquarters. Even if there are unstable elements in the army, it should only be a small part. It is time to expose them. Commander Daiqua waved his hand and gave such a military order. There was nothing to be afraid of if there were pustules in the body. What was scary was that they did not dare to squeeze them out. Doing so would only make the problem worse. Since the 6th young master had already arrived with the army, even if these people jumped out, they would not be able to do anything. What was there to be afraid of? Out of his absolute trust in Yang Qindong, Daiqua let the army assemble without worry. He wanted to see who would jump out and who would court death. At the same time, he also sent a report to Yang Qindong, informing him that the Far Eastern Army was not very stable and asking for reinforcements. Yang Qindong had thought a lot about the problem of the Far Eastern Army on the way here. Considering that he was entering alone, in order to expand the army, the political review of the source of soldiers was not so strict. As a result, there were all kinds of people mixed in. This was something he could understand. But understanding was not giving in. They ate his food and took his salary, but they wanted to rebel against his master. If he did not punish them well, where would the justice be? He handed over the task of getting rid of the traitors to Beta Persei and allocated 1,000 men from the 2nd Battalion of the Black Cavalry and 2,000 men from the 1st Cavalry Army. He wanted to deal with the unstable elements in the army with a thunderous force. Since he came to the Far East, a fortress like the first city would definitely be built here. After Beta Persei received the order, he quickly left with the army after Tian Hu left. Yang Qindong led the rest of the army straight to Archon. It was already chaotic there. The earlier they arrived, the earlier they could end the chaos there. After Daiqua received Yang Qindong's reply, he was full of confidence. The stage had been set up, and the next step was to see how those people with bad intentions would act. Tang Xing brought more than 8,000 men from the Far Eastern Army's 4th Cavalry Division to the military forest where Qinbo was. What made people speechless was that this army was still wearing the military uniform of the 5-star army. This was also a helpless move. Although they surrendered to the Mongolian army with their division commander, the other party was too poor. They were so poor that they did not have any uniform at all. They had no choice but to gather here wearing the old military uniform. Wearing the military uniform of the 5-star army, they were now going to fight the 5-star army. The sarcasm was very obvious. The direct experience was that the morale of the soldiers of the 4th Cavalry Division was very low. Most of the soldiers' faces flashed with confusion. Not everyone was as ungrateful as Tang Xing. These soldiers were all from poor families, and many of them were Russian men who had been bullied by the Mongolian cavalry. It was Qinbo who had built Ao City after arriving in the Far Eastern region. He gave them food to eat, so that they would not starve to death and did not have to worry about their safety. Although Qinbo didn't bring the families of these soldiers to Ao City for the sake of the overall stability of the situation, causing them to have a lot of worries in the future. However, their monthly wages were not little, and they were never late. With this money, they could buy some things in the city to support their own tribes. This was already something that made them feel very proud. Many warriors were still thinking that when the boys in their tribes grew up to be men, they would bring them to Ao City to join the army, so that they could better support their tribes. However, they did not expect Tang Xing to betray them. When they received the news, many of the soldiers could not understand, and no one was willing to rebel with him. However, it was at this time that Tang Xing stood up, saying that once they and the Mongolian army took over Ao City, they could bring their tribes into the city and live a good life together. It was because of this that the soldiers were appeased, and they had no choice but to stand together with their enemies, the Mongolian cavalry. Tang Xing had indeed kept his promise. After successfully chasing Qinbo out of Ao City, he agreed to let the soldiers bring their tribes into the city. However, what no one expected was that the current Arching was no longer the Arching of the past. The city had long since fallen under the control of the Mongol army. The series of measures that General Chenbo had set for the citizens had all disappeared, and no one followed them. There were many smashing, killing, robbing and pillaging within the city, and sometimes it was even more chaotic than outside. Under such circumstances, who would bring their own tribes into the city? Wouldn't that be like sending sheep into a tiger's den? It was also at this time that Tang Xing stood up again, saying that the chaos would end soon. As long as the Mongols weren't stupid, Al City would return to peace. Everyone just needed to wait patiently, and Al City would become a true refuge for everyone. In order for this day to come sooner, they needed to eliminate the Far East Army first. They had to get rid of this big problem first. It was under such circumstances that the 4th Cavalry Division left Al City, following Tang Xing to 50 miles north of the city. They acted as if they were going to attack the Far Eastern Army headquarters. Tang Xing, who had just arrived, met up with the Mongol commander, Yaryu, and learned that the Far East Army, which had been hidden for many days, was gathering here. Yaryu welcomed Tang Xing's arrival very much. There were only 2,000 Mongolian cavalry here. Although they felt that their fighting strength was not bad, the Far Eastern Army was said to have tens of thousands of soldiers. In terms of numbers, the difference was still too great. But even so, from afar, all kinds of flags fluttered high up in the sky and stood in all directions, giving off a boundless and endless feeling. It took nearly 4 hours, starting from dawn until the sun was high in the sky. Finally, the armies of both sides were in formation. Then, it was time for the commanders of each side to take the stage. As for the 5-star army, Chenbo was still recovering, so he did not appear. The one who replaced him was Daikwa. This was enough to show his authority from the fact that Chenbo's guard captain, Xia Qian, appeared beside him. Other than Daikwa, the 2nd Division's commander, Kong He, the 3rd Division's commander, Shi Xiaolin, and the 5th Division's commander, Wu Ba, all appeared with their respective cavalry. But what was interesting was that these 3 divisions were not gathered together. They maintained a certain distance between each division, giving off a sense of vigilance. In comparison, the Mongol army only had Tang Xing, Ulu, and a few other generals at the front, and their numbers were much lesser. But the advantage was that they seemed to be united. More importantly, Tang Xing was going to recruit them. This was the most important thing. This was because if this matter was done well, the military strength and morale of both sides would decrease while the other side would increase. It was even possible for there to be a reversal. After both sides were in formation, Tang Xing rode out under General Lulu's signal. In the sudden silence of both camps, this action was too eye-catching no matter how one looked at it. As Tang Xing leaped out of the formation, all kinds of discussions began to spread uncontrollably below. There were very few generals in the Far Eastern Army who did not recognize this 4th Division's commander. Especially this time, the Far Eastern Army had lost Al City, and it was all because of this person. This time, it was difficult to not recognize him. He was just a traitor. No one knew what he wanted to do. Could it be that he wanted to repent after seeing the strength of the Far Eastern Army? A few Far Eastern Army soldiers who did not know the truth thought like this. Only some officers who had other thoughts revealed an indescribable expression in their eyes. It was unknown whether they were happy, hesitant, or hesitant. Before Tang Xing spoke, they probably hadn't made a final decision. "Commander Dai, the traitor Tang Xing has come out. Please allow this general to kill him." The head of the guards, Xia Qian, glared at Tang Xing and clenched his fists when he saw him gallop out. His eyes were filled with hatred as he spoke. "No rush, no rush. Let's wait and see." On the other hand, Daikwa was not anxious at all. On the contrary, he was looking forward to the other party's performance. He wanted to see how many loyal generals and villains there were in the Far Eastern Army now. Daikwa had no intention of stopping him. Even if the other officers wanted to charge and kill the enemy, they had no choice but to suppress their anger. They wanted to see what this Tang Xing had to say. In the eyes of these brave people, if you did something wrong, you should be punished. Even if Tang Xing said something, they would not easily forgive him. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Tang Xing first swept his gaze over the Far Eastern army. After recognizing many of his colleagues, he finally opened his mouth slowly. "Everyone, I don't think I need to introduce myself. Everyone knows me. Yes, I am the traitor in the eyes of some of you." Just like that, Tang Xing's actions caused another round of discussion to erupt from the two great formations. Everyone was discussing. They had never seen such a shameless person. He actually admitted that he was a traitor. Without waiting for the discussion to continue fermenting, Tang Xing shouted again. "But I want to say now, I am not a traitor. I am loyal to my tribe. Half of my blood is Mongol. The reason why I led the Mongol army into Arching was to protect my tribe and continue to reproduce. What's wrong with that?" Tang Xing was almost shouting when he asked, "What's wrong?" After saying this, his face became a little ferocious. "Is it wrong to think for my tribe? If that's the case, what's the point of being born? If I can't even protect my own family, how can I be a man? How can I be a man?" Hiss! Hearing this, many of the soldiers sucked in a breath of cold air. These words could be said to be heart-wrenching. In ancient times, many soldiers rushed to the battlefield and shouted the slogan to be loyal to the king, to the country. But was this really the case? How many of the so-called loyal people had seen the emperor? How many people had feelings for the so-called country? In the end, soldiers fighting was just a way to make a living. Simply speaking, it was to survive. If there were other purposes, it would be to get promoted and get rich. Therefore, the slogan to be loyal to the king was just a slogan. No one would really think that way. On the contrary, more people did it for the sake of being able to survive in troubled times. There were also some people who were lucky and were promoted from soldiers to officers with some authority. Then, their goal would be higher. This was how they filled their own pockets, and how they could take advantage of the situation to create more wealth for themselves. In this way, there was the so-called eating empty pay and stealing military supplies. The direct result of this was that the upper echelons of the military wanted to win the war. This was more beneficial to their future promotion and wealth, and even their wives and children. The middle-level officers, especially those young generals who didn't have much room for promotion, thought the opposite. They wanted to win the war. Chapter 1389. All the officers who were called out lowered their heads, proving that Tang Xing was right, proving that they were having a complicated struggle in their hearts. These people were the unstable elements in the Far Eastern army. They were the internal problems that Commander Chenbo was worried about. After Arching was taken down, he did not immediately launch a counterattack. Instead, he split up the army and hid them. He was afraid that the problem would be too big. Now, after hearing Tang Xing's words, many people had been bewitched to the point that they were ready to make a move. This was especially so for some of the officers who were called out. When they noticed the changes in the gazes of the people around them, they knew that there was no point in hiding anymore. Thus, they decided to stand out and walk towards the Mongolian camp where Tang Xing was. Some of them did not only bring a single officer, they also brought their brothers and soldiers with them as they walked towards the Mongol cavalry camp. "Stop them!" Xia Qian saw that the situation was about to turn bad and quickly shouted. At this moment, Kong He and the other 3 division commanders also looked over. They looked at Daiqua, who was still riding on his horse calmly. Under everyone's gaze, Daiqua slowly raised his right hand and said calmly, "Don't stop them. Their hearts are no longer with the 5-star army. They can still be of use to us. We have to respect their choice. If there are others who have the same thoughts, you can also walk over." Not only did he not stop them, he even supported them. This made everyone confused. Tang Xing also saw Daiqua's actions and laughed. He then said, "I didn't expect General Daiqua to be such a reasonable person. However, I don't know if you have the same thoughts. You can come over as well. Don't worry, with this general here, I will ensure your wealth and glory." Tang Xing was actually persuading Daiqua to surrender. When Xiao Qian heard this, he couldn't help but reach for the scimitar at his waist. He was even prepared to kill Daikwa if Daikwa really dared to do that. He would never allow anything to happen to the Far East army that the commander had single-handedly created. Daikwa also did not expect such a move. He noticed that there were roughly 3,000 people from the Far Eastern army who had walked out and joined the Mongol army. Although there were still some people who looked hesitant, they didn't do anything out of line. These people could still be won over, so he thought it was time to stop. While Tang Xing was comforting him, he said, "Glory and wealth? Haha, Tang Xing, are you joking with me?" Since Daikwa had responded, Tang Xing was naturally delighted. He was afraid that the other party wouldn't say or do anything. If that happened, he wouldn't know where to start. But once the other party opened his mouth, his opportunity appeared. If there was a problem, there was nothing to be afraid of. All they had to do was solve it. Tang Xing smiled and wanted to ask why there was no glory and wealth. But before he could speak, Daikwa continued, "The Mongolians are so poor that they don't even have a uniform. The soldiers don't even have spare cavalry swords. They don't even bear to put salt in their food. Tell me, where did the glory and wealth come from?" The Mongolians were really poor. When they didn't know how to produce and couldn't rob others, their lives were actually very poor. The Mongolians that everyone saw killing cows and sheep were the modern Mongolians, not the old Mongolians. In the past, the Mongolians weren't good at producing. They only knew how to herd animals. If they wanted to eat a good meal, they had to wait until something happened to their animals or they died. Those were the animals that they relied on to survive. The males had to be kept, and the females had to be prepared to give birth. How could they just casually eat them? It was because they were poor that they had to go around robbing. Daikwa's question made Tang Xing's expression change. He didn't know how to answer. And this was just the beginning. Through the radio, Daikwa knew and prepared much more than Tang Xing. He looked at Tang Xing with a contemptuous gaze and said, "The glory and wealth you told everyone about should be just a saying. You're trying to deceive everyone, right? But how wise am I? How could I be so easily fooled like these idiots?" As he spoke, Daikwa pointed at the men who had just joined the Mongolian army from the Far Eastern army. Being reprimanded, the traitors, who had a guilty conscience, naturally lowered their heads. There were also some people who looked at Tang Xing. Evidently, they wanted to hear his explanation. They wanted to know if the glory and wealth he had mentioned was real or fake. Seeing these people staring at him, Tang Xing felt his hair stand on end. He quickly waved his hands and explained, "Everyone, don't listen to his nonsense. He's just messing with our morale." "Messing with your morale? Ha ha ha, you think too highly of yourself. Do you think you're worthy of talking about morale? You're just a bunch of mobs. You'll go wherever there are benefits. You don't have any principles at all. You don't know what loyalty is. You don't deserve to be human." Daikwa's voice was very loud as he shouted at Tang Xing and the soldiers who had just surrendered. This shout made Tang Xing and the others feel a sense of panic. In order to stabilize the morale of the army, he had to shout as loudly as well. "He's talking nonsense. The Mongolian army has now taken over Al City. Everyone has seen the wealth and prosperity there with their own eyes." "Yes, yes." Because of Tang Xing's words, the traitors who had been slightly shaken started to nod their heads again. They then glared at Daikwa fiercely, as if saying, "You're talking nonsense, you're messing up our morale. Al City prosperous!" Ha ha ha. As if he had heard the funniest joke in the world, Daikwa looked up to the sky and laughed. Although he was also a division commander in the Far Eastern Army, he had been traveling with Yang Qindong for a while and had conquered many territories. He had seen a lot, and the prosperity of Al City was not worth mentioning in his eyes. Although he had not been to Qiqian City, just the prosperity of the beginning city was many times better than Al City. After laughing for a while, Daikwa seemed to have finished expressing the laughter in his heart. Then, he looked at Tang Xing and the others with disdain and said, "In your eyes, Al City might be very busy, but right now, it is not in my eyes. Taking a step back, what does the prosperity of Al City have to do with you? Do you really think that the Mongolians will treat you as their own and give you benefits? Tang Xing's face was a little ugly. Of course, he knew that the Mongolians were always on guard against him. In the past 3 months, he had felt it deeply in Al City. However, at this moment, when the armies were about to clash, he definitely could not admit it. Not only that, he had to praise the Mongolian army. Only then would he be able to raise their morale and obtain victory. After hesitating for a few breaths, Tang Xing opened his mouth and said, "Why can't you give it to us? I might as well tell you that Hulahan has already agreed. In the future, Al City will belong to us. Other than our families, our people can also move in." What? Did the Mongolian Great Khan really say that? If that's the case, it's a great thing. In an instant, the Far Eastern Army soldiers started to mutter and discuss. Previously, because the city was too small and could not accommodate so many people, Chenbo made the rule that other than soldiers, ordinary people could not enter the city. It was also because of this that it attracted all sorts of complaints, and caused Tang Xing to rebel. Tang Xing also grasped this point, which was why his actions had gained the support of more soldiers. It was only because of his call that more than 3,000 soldiers joined his side. This was Tang Xing's trump card. The reason why he was so confident that he could face the Far Eastern Army with just 10,000 cavalry was also because of this reason. Right now, everyone was discussing animatedly, and the public opinion was obviously leaning towards his side. In order to stabilize the situation and also to speed up Dai Qua's defeat, he intentionally looked at the Mongolian General Ulu and said, "If everyone doesn't believe me, you can go and ask General Ulu." Ulu had never heard that the Mongolian army wanted to take control of Al City with Tang Xing. However, he was not stupid enough to deny all of this. He thought that as long as he won the battle, he could do whatever he wanted. He immediately laughed and said, "That's right, General Tang Xing is right. The Great Khan did say that he was willing to take control of Al City with the brothers of the Far Eastern Army and share the world. You're lying." Just as Wu Lu finished speaking and Tang Xing's expression relaxed, Dai Qua shouted loudly, "Stop it!" Dai Qua shouted. He did not expect Tang Xing to be so shameless. Furthermore, this Mongolian general was actually lying through his teeth. He had already received the telegram. The Mongolian army had already left Arching after looting the place. How could he say such a thing? Knowing that the other party was lying, Dai Qua could not let him continue. After he interrupted the other party's words, he said loudly, "Everyone, don't listen to their nonsense. Truth be told, the Mongol army has already left Al City after a round of inhumane pillaging." Nonsense! Dai Qua's words immediately caused Ulu and Tang Xing to refute in unison. One of them was one of Hulahan's favorite generals, while the other was entrusted with an important task to deal with the Far Eastern Army. With such a status, how could he believe that Hulahan had already betrayed him? The two naturally did not believe it, but Dai Qua, who had received the news, laughed and said, "I knew you wouldn't believe it, but don't worry, there will be evidence in front of you soon. Come on, release the signal."